Good morning, everybody. The hearing will come to order. Welcome to the Committee on the Budget's hearing regarding wasteful, and bloated bureaucracy. It's a mouthful. Now I'd like to yield myself such time as I may consume for an opening statement. I'm going to try to speak a little just off the cuff here because this is something I've been thinking about for a while and something we've been discussing as a committee for now a few months. We're in a real mess financially. We did a fiscal state of the nation hearing, and I think we all agreed, even though we may not agree on exactly how to address it. We agreed that the financial health of our country is in decline and that the deficit, spending, and debt trajectory is absolutely and completely unsustainable, and we have to do something about it. I think the debt ceiling proposal that Republicans passed out of the House is a good first step. It's just a step, but it's an important step to getting our fiscal house in order. And it reflects the principles that will be reflected in our budget resolution. Rein in the spending, right-size the bureaucracy, and encourage growth. Get our economy off high center. Get out of this nosedive into recession and get us back on the path to prosperity once again. I've said this to my friend, Mr. Boyle. Republicans have contributed to this over time as well, and I don't think anybody as a lawmaker or leader of this country has any credibility if they don't understand that fact. But let me say this, we have never experienced in the history of our country the avalanche of spending like we have seen and witnessed in the last 2 years. $10 trillion of spending, 6 of which has been added to our national debt, all of which has contributed to record inflation, soaring interest rates, an economy that is sliding quickly into recession, and getting us closer, and I don't think anybody knows exactly when. The problem is when you tip over the precipice into a sovereign debt crisis, all bets are off at that point. I mean, we're borrowing $1.5 trillion today as a government, and the gap in funding our government will be $3 trillion if we just keep the policies we have now in 10 years. So if you undermine the currency and our ability to borrow, it looks really bleak. And that's why we have to have a sense of urgency, Democrats and Republicans, to deal with this. And that's why I hope and pray that the President and our colleagues in the Senate and my Democrat friends will come to the table and let's raise the debt ceiling responsibly by allowing our nation to pay its bills, protect the good faith and credit of the United States, but at the same time address this out-of-control spending that has put hardworking American families in a real bind, like a real bind. Think about this. This statistic is startling to me. An average family of 4 is paying $13,000 per year more to purchase the same goods and services they did January 2021. $13,000, over $1,000 a month. 6 out of 10 Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, y'all. 45%, I read this yesterday, Ms. Gressler, 45% of Americans say that if they had an emergency that cost more than $1,000, they can't survive it. We see savings down, we see credit card debt and consumer debt up at the highest levels. This is a crisis. This is a cost of living crisis. It's driven by inflation, and inflation's been driven by, in large part, spending. So I encourage my friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle, work with us and encourage the president to do what 3 out of 4 Americans expect him to do and all of us to do. 3 out of 4 say the president ought to negotiate fiscal reforms in the debt ceiling. He's done it before. That's the thing, Ralph. He's done it before in 2011. The last major right-sizing of the bureaucracy and the reining in of the spending that was excessive was led by none other than Joe Biden as vice president. And he was proud to do it, as he should have been, and he did it as senator. So this isn't unprecedented. This isn't unusual. In fact, I would say it would be unusual and even irresponsible if we don't do something to pay our bills and rein in the spending at the same time, in a very sensible way, in a very straightforward way. And I believe that's what the Republicans have done in the House by passing the Limit, Save, Grow Act. And now I hope that our colleagues will respond responsibly and in kind. Here's the bottom line. Our federal government is 40% bigger today than it was in 2019 as we were going into unprecedented pandemic. So coming out of the pandemic, CBO projected we'd be spending in discretionary spending hundreds of billions of dollars less than we're spending today. President Obama's last budget had us spending less than we're spending now. His last budget projected that. Folks, there's bloat, there's excessive spending, there are programs and policies that need to be repealed. And if we do that, we've got a fighting chance to bring down inflation and to give our children a more hopeful future with respect to our nation's finances. Look, I could go through this list here because I've got a speech, Brendan, but I want to share something with everybody that is just as hot off the press here. CBO gave us a mid-fiscal year report, 7 months into the fiscal year. Here's their report. We are borrowing at 236% higher rate than we did this time, over that time frame rather, last year. That's $400 billion more borrowing this year over the first 7 months than last year. The biggest driver of the spending, or drivers, one, 40% increase in interest payments. Chuck, our interest payments this year will be $500 billion. We'll triple that with just the current policies. In 10 years, we'll be spending $1.5 trillion in interest payments. Not a single soldier will benefit, not a single senior, not an anti-poverty program, not infrastructure. We get nothing for it. It's up 40%, guys, in the first 7 months of this year over last year. The other driver is 56% or $48 billion in increased spending at the Department of Education because President Biden did what I believe is unconstitutional, certainly an overreach and very reckless, to cancel almost $700 billion of student loans. Basically, having lower income families, many of whom just said, I can't go to college because I can't afford it, basically writing off the debt for upper and middle income folks and increasing inflation with respect to college tuition. So that's a driver. And then, of course, inflation's impacted Medicare's trust fund. It's impacted Social Security Trust Fund. Medicare now is up 15% as a result. That's $61 billion. Social Security spending up 11%. That's $73 billion. We're accelerating this insolvency problem for important senior safety nets. Guys, that came out just 2 days ago. I won't go through the army of IRS agents. I won't go through the excessive and expensive and unnecessary climate policies, hundreds of billions. I won't go through the expansion of healthcare to people who already had healthcare and make hundreds of $500,000 a year. Makes no sense. It's wasteful. It's unnecessary. And I certainly can highlight some of what I would refer to as progressive Democrat or woke earmarks. $3 million for the LGBTQ museum, $2 million to promote dirt bike culture in Baltimore, $1.2 million for Pride Centers in San Diego, $3.6 million for the Michelle Obama Trail in Decatur, Georgia. If the folks in New York want to build an LGBTQ museum, have at it. But the people in Lubbock, Texas ought not to underwrite it. Let's get back to our core function. We are washed in waste, folks. We are in a sustained inflation crisis, and we got to get this thing back on track, and we got to do it soon. So, I welcome our witnesses. Our mission is to restore fiscal sanity in this place and to get our house in order and to make sure that our country's future is not bleak as it is today, but bright because we're doing what every American's doing, tightening our belts, changing our spending habits, and paying our bills. So with that, Mr. Ranking Member, I'll let you have as much time as you may consume because I consumed more than I thought.
All 20 minutes?
10. I'll give you half of what I took.
I am kidding. Mr. Chairman, in all seriousness, no, I have to say at first I'm disappointed. You only used the word woke twice. I had bet the over because I know how much my Republican friends love using the word woke. If we had $1 for every time they use the word, we'd be able to pay off the national debt. Still to this day, I have no idea what exactly the word means, and I can't say I'm terribly interested in finding out. I'm more interested kind of in responding, though, to the chairman's principled viewpoint on where this economy is, and I couldn't disagree more. And here's why. His very pessimistic assessment of doom and gloom and that the debt is doomed us and that Americans are struggling today more so than at any time in our history, that perception runs completely contrary to all of the evidence in front of us. Right now in America, we have lower unemployment than at any time in my lifetime, and I'm 46. You have to go back 55 years till the last time we had an unemployment rate this low. He brought up inflation, which has been a challenge. The good news is, as the data showed yesterday, 8 consecutive months inflation has dropped. Inflation, which of course was caused worldwide coming out of the pandemic, inflation is lower in the US than the UK, Germany, France, most of our peer countries, and the average of OECD countries. We are such a marvel, as I pointed out when we had a good, vigorous debate on the House floor last session week over the DOA Act. The Economist magazine just a couple weeks ago devoted their entire cover and a leading article to just attempting to explain the marvel of the American economy. It is brought up to me by colleagues of ours who serve in other Western parliaments, some of our respective NATO countries, attempting to figure out why it is that the US growth rate is better than our Western peers. Our unemployment rate is better. Our inflation rate is lower. Now, do we have real challenges still? Absolutely. I come from blue-collar Philadelphia. I am well aware of the challenges that ordinary Americans face. We help people in our constituent service offices every day with real challenges. But the way to help them is not to pass a bill, as the House of Representatives did 2 weeks ago, that according to Moody's would lead to 800,000 fewer jobs by the end of next year, and a greater likelihood of a recession. Again, quoting from Moody's report. That is not the way to go. The way to go is not to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States. We have raised the debt ceiling 103 times since 1940, the majority of which were under Republican presidents. We voted, including myself, 3 times under the most recent Republican president. And do you know that in those 3 debt ceiling increases, 2 of the 3 did not cut spending, they increased spending in that very vote. So we cannot suddenly change our views on this based on the political party of the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That is unfair to the American people and risks our economic growth. The kind of things that were in that DOA bill that I hope we'll have a real discussion about today would have devastating consequences. And by the way, while we had, I thought, a very good, vigorous debate and discussion on the House floor 2 weeks ago that always stayed on message and there was no invective from either side, and I appreciate the Budget Committee members on both sides who participated. That said, what about regular order? We should have had a hearing on that bill in this committee before it went straight to the floor. I tend to remember swearing-in day taking a whole week and my wife and daughter missing my actual swearing in because they had to head home because it took place after midnight, Friday night into Saturday morning, and that one of the big topics was supposed to be a desire to return to committee work in regular order before things were rushed to the floor. Unfortunately, that did not happen. So I hope today, 2 weeks late, we can take this opportunity to have essentially the committee hearing on the bill that passed 2 weeks ago, even though it is clear that that bill will be DOA in the Senate. Nonetheless, what's in it reveals the priorities of those who wrote it. And we have to ensure that the devastating consequences that would result if that bill were to ever to become law, we have to make sure that those consequences are known to the American people. So with that, despite you generously offering me more time, I did use 5.5 minutes. I will yield there. Look forward to hearing from the witnesses as well as our colleagues. Thank you.
I thank my good friend from Pennsylvania. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, I would ask that you submit it for the record. I will hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not yet have prepared written statements. Once again, I'd like to welcome our witnesses this morning, and today we'll hear from Ms. Gressler, Rachel Gressler, Senior Research Fellow on Budget and Entitlements at the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Myron Ebel, Director of the Center for Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Ms. Paige Augustine. Did I get it right? Ms. Paige Augustine, who is the Policy Director at the Center for Renewing America, and then Mr. Indivar Dattagupta. For West Texan, you're not going to get any better than that. We welcome you. Mr. Dattagupta is President and Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Policy, and we're honored that you would take time out of your busy lives to share your insights with us. Committee has received your written statements. They'll be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and I now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Gressler.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Rachel Gressler. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in Economics, Budget, and Entitlements at the Heritage Foundation. My remarks today are mine and don't necessarily represent those of the Heritage Foundation. So paying the correct amount of taxes to the federal government is not optional. The IRS now has an extra $80 billion to make sure that Americans are properly paying their taxes. Meanwhile, the federal government spent $245 billion of taxpayers' money last year, that is $1,800 per household, on improper payments. But instead of increased audits, most government programs get rewarded with bigger budgets. This double standard should not exist. Last year, 1 out of every 6 Medicaid dollars and 1 out of every 4 CHIP dollars represented an improper payment. That's enough to purchase health insurance for 15 million individuals. In the earned income tax credit, 1 out of every $3 was an improper payment. What that means is that for the government to properly transfer $1 to an individual, they have to take $1.46 from somebody else. I estimated that more than 40% of the pandemic unemployment insurance benefits, that's $357 billion in total, went to individuals who were not unemployed. And while the media did pick up on international crime rings, even Chinese state-sponsored hackers stealing Americans' identities and taxpayers' money, there's little attention and zero consequences to government programs that regularly squander taxpayers' dollars. Any solution to reducing improper payments will require both verifying identity and eligibility and imposing accountability, and that includes consequences. Most improper payments come from failure to verify that people are who they say they are and that they're eligible for the benefits that they claim. According to this year's GAO report, 59% of improper payments were the result of agencies' failures to obtain the data needed to verify payments. Another 25% was the result of non-existent or inaccessible data. So better data is crucial, but it will be meaningless if agencies aren't held accountable when they fail to steward taxpayers' dollars. For example, federal agencies already are required to use the Do Not Pay database. But what they do is they ping that database, they send out the payments, and then afterwards, they get the results from that database when the money has already gone out the door. To improve integrity and accountability across government programs, I propose the creation of a Taxpayer Integrity Office, or a TIO, within the Treasury Department. And that TIO should have 5 responsibilities. 1, improving eligibility and ID verification. 2, strengthening information sharing across government. 3, maintaining competitive, responsive, and secure systems. 4, establishing and enforcing reasonable standards for agencies to follow. And 5, and most importantly, is enacting meaningful consequences for agencies' failure. Finally, while improper payments are a major problem, they are a symptom of the bigger disease, which is improper federal spending. When the federal government expands its role into areas of people's lives that are better addressed within households and businesses, by state and local governments, or by charitable and religious organizations, that's government bloat that comes at the expense of personal freedom and opportunity. The federal government spent $4.2 trillion last year on transfer payments. That's over $32,000 per household. It's also 9 out of every $10 the federal government collected, and 2 out of every $3 the federal government spent. Bigger government means even bigger improper payments. As this chart will show, federal payments have increased at 3 times the rate of GDP. That's the middle yellow line there. Improper payments have increased at 4.5 times the rate of GDP since 2005. At these current rates, improper payments plus interest costs could total $4 trillion over the next 10 years. Constantly expanding entitlement programs without any consideration of what they will cost is unsustainable, and taking people's money and requiring them to jump through bureaucratic hoops to get things that the government thinks they need makes it harder for ordinary Americans to earn a living and to pursue what is best for them as their families. So to reduce improper federal spending and empower people instead of bureaucrats, policymakers should replace tax credits with lower overall tax rates, enact universal savings accounts to make it simpler and more accessible to save, reject new entitlement programs, and reform existing ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gressler. Now we will yield 5 minutes to Mr. Ebel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Boyle, for inviting me to testify today. My name is Myron Ebel, and I am Director of the Center for Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. we concentrate on regulatory issues from a free market perspective. And so our work is endless. I want to congratulate you, Chairman Arrington, on your leadership in passing H.R. 2811, the Limit, Save, Grow Act. I think this, as you said, is an important first step. And I think it puts the forces of fiscal sanity on the offensive in Washington for the first time in a long time. I want to just say that I believe, and I say this in my written testimony, that the most important part of the spending cuts that you have is repeal of Senator Manchin's so-called Inflation Reduction Act, particularly the energy subsidies, which are huge. This is not only wasteful spending of money that the federal government does not have. It's not only handouts to special corporate interests. Subsidies distort markets, and that's why CEI opposes all mandates and subsidies in the energy sector. I think we oppose all mandates and subsidies, but I may be going too far. But there's one thing about most subsidies, conventional subsidies, they actually lower the cost of the product or service that's being subsidized. So for example, if Mexico subsidizes tortillas so that poor people can get enough to eat, that will lower the cost of tortillas. The perverseness of the energy subsidies is that they have the effect of lowering the cost of one particular product or contributor in the energy sector while actually raising total costs. This is perverse. So we subsidize corporate interests to build huge wind factories and solar factories. That lowers the cost of wind and solar, but it actually raises the price of electricity. We see this throughout the world. Germany has gone the furthest. They have the world's highest electric rates, maybe Denmark, but they've gone just as far. The consequence of this is even worse than raising the cost of electricity. The massive misinvestment in wind and solar and other handouts, but I don't have time to go into all of them. The cost is also that it's destroying our energy infrastructure. How is that so? Well, massive misinvestment in wind and solar, there has consequently been massive underinvestment in conventional dispatchable sources. And let me use the example of Texas rather than California, which is usually we point to California. But let me talk about Texas for a moment. In 1999, Ken Lay of Enron convinced Governor George W. Bush to support a renewable electricity standard for Texas. Since that time, to take advantage of the subsidies, since that time, Texas has had massive overinvestment, misinvestment in wind, massive closures of coal-fired power plants, massive underinvestment in dispatchable gas plants, and now the Texas legislature and the governor are trying to figure out what to do about it because Texas faces a reliability crisis. And the answer that many people in the legislature seem to be coming up with is, well, we'll keep taking the wind and solar subsidies and we'll now subsidize gas plants. This is crazy. The other thing I'd just like to close with is, it took 150 years to build the electric infrastructure. It took 150 years to build the oil infrastructure. And President Biden claims that we're going to transform it in a so-called clean energy transition in a decade. This is impossible. This is a train wreck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ebel. And now we will yield 5 minutes to Ms. Augustin.
Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member Boyle, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. Late last year, the Center for Renewing America released a proposed budget that sought to provide a strategic vision, indelibly linking the efforts for getting our nation's finances in order with removing the menace of woke and weaponized bureaucracy, which is aimed squarely at the American people. The main thing I hope to leave with you today is a conviction that the woke enterprise is in fact a cultural revolution bent on destroying America. The federal government is now a main distribution channel of it, and if you do not act soon, we will not have a country left. So first, what does woke mean? Historically, woke meant being aware of racial injustices. However, decades later, woke is now identity-based neo-Marxism, and its goal is to destroy American society. The woke adopt the view that our society is structured to oppress the marginalized and that differences between groups are attributable to this systemic oppression. The required solution is to abolish those oppressive norms in the name of equity, that is, equal outcomes regardless of merit. In sum, the woke stoke division among Americans based on identity in order to tear down the republic, eliminate capitalism, marginalize religion, and rupture the nuclear family. As I mentioned, our budget proposal took an in-depth look at each department and found that the federal bureaucracy is a significant funder of this woke cultural revolution. It is the framework by which the bureaucracy operates. It is how it structures its programs and makes funding decisions and what trainings and guidelines it adopts. And because the bureaucracy is so big and spends trillions of dollars, private businesses are happily coerced into the same mission. Just a small sample of what we found in health and education and foreign aid. The Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institutes of Health actively push so-called gender-affirming care, which is cross-sex hormones and surgical mutilation, even for minors. NIH funds human fetal tissue harvesting from aborted babies for medical research. And CDC spent nearly $6 billion to address so-called COVID health disparities through the lens of health equity. 25 states allow Medicaid to pay for chemical castration via hormone therapy, and 23 states pay for irreversible and mutilating genital surgery. And the Biden administration's Section 1557 rule would require all insurance to cover chemical castration and sex change surgeries or be deemed discriminatory. Federal grants often have a specific woke purpose, but they also serve as a taxpayer-funded lifeline to civil institutions committed to spreading the woke dogma. The University of Maryland Medical System performs gender transition surgeries on boys and girls at the earliest onset of puberty as young as 9 and 10 years old, and received a $3.5 million grant to increase mental health and advance gender-affirming care. Or take $4.7 million in a CDC grant to the National Minority AIDS Council for training and technical assistance. That organization engages in pro-Black Lives Matter activism and promotes radical gender theory. 3 CDC grants totaling $8 million went to Access Matters, which is based in Philadelphia, for so-called family health care. That organization says its abortion services are provided through the lens of equity, which means explicitly pushing abortion on vulnerable minority populations. The Department of Education, often under the guise of culturally responsive learning and social emotional learning, is an active adversary of parents and citizens concerned about the inherent race essentialism of CRT and gender theory. Through its Equity Assistance Centers, it trains teachers to incorporate critical race theory and gender transition of children without parental knowledge. It also provided more than $60 million through its SEED program to morph teachers into essentially progressive activists. The department's cultural learning was featured in its K-12 history and civics education competitive grant program, which reminds applicants that America is systemically racist and emphasized both Ibrahim Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and the factually challenged 1619 project. Lastly, at least for this testimony, the State Department's diplomatic programs remain geared toward exporting woke ideology abroad. Millions of dollars go to support programs like gay pride parades in Prague, LGBTI activists in Senegal, LGBTQIA+ social events in Australia, and drag theater in Ecuador. Woke is the umbrella ideology, and it uses all manner of terms and concepts like equity and inclusion. Every dollar should be examined to determine what, in fact, the country is spending money on. This should absolutely not be an exercise in austerity wherein every program must take a hit. Wokeness is now essentially a taxpayer-funded secular religion crafted by secular elites to supplant the nation's Judeo-Christian traditions that have stood the test of time. It is dangerous, existentially dangerous, for Congress to continue funding the priorities of a neo-Marxist ideology that seeks only to destroy that which has come before. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Augustin. Now we yield 5 minutes to Mr. Dattagupta.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and the committee, members of the committee. My name is Indi Dattagupta, and I'm President and Executive Director of the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP. CLASP is a national, nonpartisan nonprofit using research and analysis to promote effective policy solutions to end poverty and advance racial and gender equity. This morning, I'll discuss why many people rely on federal programs to achieve economic security and why the deep cuts mandated under the McCarthy debt ceiling bill would undermine the nation's well-being. Finally, I'll discuss the importance of raising revenues and the dangers of failing to raise the debt limit. So first, why do people rely on federal programs for economic security? Well, the United States suffers from an unusual number of low-wage, low-paid jobs, ranking 39th out of 42 OECD countries. As a result, many who benefit from support programs are simply workers paid too little to make ends meet. Others experience low incomes due to the hazards of life, including illness, disability, death of a family member, outliving savings, underemployment, intimate partner violence, and caring for a loved one. Fortunately, a vast array of rigorous empirical studies has demonstrated that individual programs and our social protection system overall helps families with low incomes stabilize their lives, maintain employment, advance in the labor market, and help their children thrive. Unfortunately, our still very high prevalence of economic insecurity harms us all. Allowing child poverty alone to persist costs us nearly $1.5 trillion annually. Unsurprisingly, the McCarthy bill's deep cuts would undermine the nation's well-being. The House debt ceiling bill would set dangerously low caps on appropriations that would go harsher over time. If House Republicans later exclude from the caps defense spending and veterans medical spending, even as defense and veterans health costs grow, virtually all other appropriated spending would need to be eliminated. Let that sink in. Supports on the chopping block include childcare, which supports parents while they work or go to school to improve their employment prospects, post-secondary education and workforce development, which can offer credentials required for better jobs and supports our small businesses, and food safety, public health, and basic transportation programs that benefit all of us. The bill would also use work reporting requirements to limit access to Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF, programs that help families, including more than 1 million veterans, access opportunity and thrive. Extensive evidence proves that such work requirements do little to promote work, but they do increase hardship, harming many who merely fail to meet and overcome the red tape these requirements create. So instead, revenues must be part of the answer. The United States is a low-tax country, ranking 32 out of 38 OECD countries. And tax cuts have actually propelled us to our current debt levels. The Bush tax cuts, their extensions, and the Trump tax cuts alone are responsible for most of the increase in the ratio of debt to economic output since 2001, and more than 90% of the increase if we exclude the cost of combating COVID-19 and the prior recession. Yet the McCarthy bill would reduce revenues by cutting the IRS budget and making it harder to collect taxes owed by the wealthy and corporations. We face serious dangers if we fail to raise our arbitrary debt limit. A default could spark a financial crisis, causing millions of job losses and decimating retirement savings. It would make borrowing more expensive and reduce families' abilities to build wealth through home ownership, through education, or through entrepreneurship. Millions of people would immediately feel the impact of a stop in government spending through delays in Social Security, veterans' disability payments, and more. A recession, which the proposed cuts could trigger, would harm everyone, particularly workers paid the lowest wages, young people, and communities of color, many of whom are among the last hired and first fired. The House-passed bill is an ideological wish list that would also wreck our economy. Congress should not pass any deal that increases hardship, never mind one that asks struggling families to foot the bill so the richest corporations and households can evade their taxes. Instead, Congress should raise the debt ceiling on its own now and get to the work of investing in our families and communities, which make our nation strong. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Dedagupta and all of our witnesses. We're going to go into the question and answer session. I want to start by yielding myself 5 minutes, and I'm going to focus on the economic policies and consequences side of this discussion. Mr. Ebel, my colleagues may have a different view of the economy and the path we're on and the projections that we've received from nonpartisan groups like CBO. I believe things are really bad, and I think they're going to get a lot worse if we don't change. GDP is at 1.1% in this first quarter. It's down from the last quarterly report, which was down from the last quarterly report because of interest rates. And interest rates are coming at us in hikes that we haven't experienced in a while because of inflation. Labor participation rates are low, et cetera, et cetera. But you talked about regulations. That's one that I don't think, that's a side of policies and economic impact that I don't think we quantify enough or discuss enough, the deleterious effects on our economy. $400 billion is what I understand, sir. $400 billion in additional regulatory cost in 2 years from this administration. My understanding, it's twice the clip of President Obama and 6 or 7 times the amount of regulatory burden and cost of the previous administration, President Trump. What do you say about over-regulating and its adverse impacts on us at this point, coming out of a recession and having the prospect of growth and jobs and higher wages and all the good things that come with that? Thank you, Chairman. Hit your button, please.
Yeah,
There you go.
there. Thank you, Chairman Arrington. Yes, I agree with you. The three dampers on economic growth and prosperity are overtaxing, overspending, and overregulating. And my colleague at CEI, Wayne Cruz, is the real expert on this, on regulation. He has spent his entire career trying to quantify and identify the costs of regulation. In the energy sector, we see that regulation is a huge damper on the use and the production of energy. And I would say this: if you want to look at a place to get some economic growth, what I would call the Trump energy dominance agenda is what we need to return to. It turns out, because of the shale oil and gas revolution, that America is the world's energy superpower. And the so-called clean energy transition is an attempt to take us back to the days when we were incredibly dependent upon foreign countries for our energy. We used to run several $100 billion of deficits in importing oil every year. We're now an oil exporter and a gas exporter. Instead of that, what the clean energy transition proposes is that we become almost entirely dependent upon China for the critical minerals that are used in windmills, solar panels, and electric batteries. So this is, we're going in the wrong direction right now. I think your bill is a good step moving us back in the right direction.
Let me follow on that comment about wind and solar. My district actually produces more wind than any district in America, by the way, but we also sit on top of the Permian Basin. So we get to say that we produce all the above. But I am concerned about the distorting effect that you talked about with respect to reliable and affordable sources of energy. By the way, sources of energy we may need if we were ever to go to war, for example, with China. We'd also need financing for that war, which I'm very concerned that we wouldn't have. But one of the elements of the Green Energy Corporation subsidies, one element of my concern is that they're 3 times higher than what they were marketed and sold during the IRA. The other piece is much of the component parts, if not the majority, of solar and wind are coming from China. I read an article where China was going to benefit to the tune of $125 billion. Can you make a quick comment there, and then I'm going to move on, let my ranking member ask questions.
You're absolutely right. There's a lot to be said about this, but we have traded energy independence for being dependent upon a potential adversary for everything that keeps our economy going, which is the stuff that moves and produces energy.
Thank you for your quick comment. Now, Mr. Boyle, I yield 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Indy, you mentioned something in your opening statement that I was very glad to hear because you rarely hear it either on Capitol Hill or just in the media as part of this discourse, and that is the great missing tax revenue. 2001, George W. Bush tax cuts, which weren't paid for. 2003, George W. Bush tax cuts, which also weren't paid for. Their extension, which was done on a bipartisan basis about a decade later. And then, of course, the 2017 Trump tax cuts. All told, are you able to put a number on just exactly how much missing tax revenue there is? Of course, as you pointed out, as you know, you think about that, it's too often around here, we hear about the spending side, but we don't hear about the whole other half of the equation, which is the revenue side. Want to make sure that if we're going to really talk about deficit and debt, we talk about both sides of the ledger.
That's right. Thank you, Ranking Member Boyle. We have, in many ways, as I mentioned, propelled ourselves into our current ratio of debt to our economic activity because of these tax cuts. Just to put it in perspective, in a decade or so, we would actually have seen that ratio decline were it not for these tax cuts and their extensions. So
The debt to GDP
the debt to GDP ratio would actually decline. The tax cuts on their own have added about $10 trillion to the debt since 2001, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And I'll just emphasize quickly that in the United States, the overall tax, the taxes paid as a share of our economy and our economic activity is much closer to middle-income countries and like Mexico even than it is to our wealthy peers who have higher living standards than the lower tax countries. So I think what we ultimately all want is higher living standards for the American people. And if anything, our low taxes are getting in the way of that here. We're not trying to reduce people's ability to have those high living standards. We want to reduce the cost of living that they face. And
this is before we even look at the disproportionate impact of those tax cuts in terms of where most of that money was going. I mean, the most recent round of tax cuts, the one for which I was here, the Trump tax cuts, officially called the TCJA, CBO estimated 83% of that going to the top 1% by the end of the 10-year window. Let me transition real quickly, though, to the debt ceiling, because this is something I've worked on for a long time. And while I think many people are now coming to understand the devastating consequences of default, I think there is a part of the conversation, though, that has been missed, and that is while the question of whether we default or not is binary, that obscures there's a whole continuum between then and now in which we could also suffer consequences, even if we ultimately raise the debt ceiling by the deadline. So I was wondering if you could talk about what happened in 2011, We did suffer the first ever credit downgrade in American history. One of the 3 credit agencies downgraded us, which according to the Government Accountability Office cost us over $1 billion in extra borrowing costs. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
That's right, and I'll just add that households suffer. Their household wealth fell by almost $2.5 trillion over the second and third quarter of 2011 as a result. Consumer confidence fell, mortgage spreads increased, and it led to hundreds of dollars a month in increased borrowing costs for new borrowers. So approaching the debt ceiling just makes it harder for Treasury to issue regular debt, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and increased costs throughout financial markets as well.
I would also just share in the 30 seconds I have left, based on conversations I've had, I feel quite confident that unfortunately the other credit agencies will downgrade us if this debt ceiling drama plays out much longer. And that, of course, has so many impacts. You just described what happened in 2011 in terms of household wealth. I fear this time it would, in fact, be worse. It's all the more reason that we solve this now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Ralph Norman.
We got 2 different worlds up here. We really do. We're diametrically opposed in our viewpoint, in our thinking. Congressman Boyle, you mentioned about regular order on the border bill and on the bill we put up to the Senate to cut rein-in spending. It didn't go through regular order. I was one of the 20 that objected to bills we held out until things do go through regular order. Reason these 2 bills didn't, on the spending bill that we presented to the Senate, this administration is not cutting $1. He's made his thoughts known. No cuts, clean debt ceiling raise, which is insane. A lemonade stand run by a 12-year-old can find cuts, at least $1. This administration doesn't. What does his budget do? Biden's budget, $2 billion more, just a few, to increase regulations of the firearms industry. $512 million to provide money for abortion services to the Department of Health and Human Services. $3 billion for, quote, marginalized communities to promote advanced gender equity and equality. It goes on and on. So that's why the 2 bills didn't go through on the border bill. There's no reason to have a debate. This administration is opening the doors to every country in the world to come into the United States, which has never been done. And the sad part about it, when the cities start hollering like New York did, that they're out of money, they're going to come to the federal government. Guess what? The federal government has no money to spend. Mr. Dudagupta, I heard your comments, which really were amazing, that you would make the statements that you've made. Just raise the debt ceiling. Corporations need to pay more tax. Have you ever run a small business?
I run a small nonprofit.
Nonprofit. Have you ever had a business where you had to hire employees?
That's what I do.
No, your agency is supported by the profits of companies and the small businesses. Am I wrong? Yes, I'm right.
It's supported by foundations, individual donors.
Here's what I'd suggest you do. Get out on Main Street America. Explain how the inflation, which has increased 14.9%, how are they handling that? Explain how food prices are up 17%. How are they handling that? Gas prices, 37%, from abandoning our natural resources and buying from countries from OPEC that hate America. Let them explain that to you. Real wages have decreased by 3.5% because of inflation. Why do you think the rating for this administration is so low? His policies are insane, and it's tearing the country down. Now, we have a lot of hot air and wind up here too in Congress. We're going to take action on cuts. And thank God the leverage on the debt ceiling. The Democrats in the Senate have got some consequences. Let them not put forward their plan. I heard not one plan that you offer, it was just criticisms. Let's let them put it in writing, as businesses have to do, on what their plan to solve this crisis. Now, I assume corporations, I don't know whether you understand it or not, but corporations don't pay tax. It's the people that pay the tax. Corporations don't pay it. So I think that where we are right now, if your house is on fire, you don't rearrange the furniture around the pool. And that's what this Republican led House, which is in charge of the purse strings, is going to do, one way or another. And I'm tired of the talk. We're going to put it forward. And I've yet to hear a plan by this administration to offer any solution other than just spend more money. It's an insult to the American people, and it's an insult to our military, and it's what they're attempting to put us in a bind by more spending is going to shipwreck this country, along with every other thing that this administration has done. Ms. Gretzel, I was very impressed with your proposal about putting together a group to oversee the fraud and abuse. Would you go into how we would implement that? And real quickly, we got 35 seconds.
Yeah, it's Taxpayer Integrity Office within the Treasury Department. You could use the existing funding that is there. And the biggest thing is that they need to have the authority to impose the consequences.
You know, a thought would be to put a panel of business people who have no agenda, who don't have to answer to the lobbyists, who can say this makes sense and question everything. That's what this country needs now more than ever. Thank you all for what you're doing, Mr. Ebel and Paige. I wish we had more time, but you're a voice of reason and a voice we're going to consider. Thank you so much. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman, and we now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, my friend, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let's make very clear that the U.S. economy is not in decline. It's healthy and it's growing. Under President Biden, for the past 24 months, 14 million jobs have been created. The unemployment rate is at 3.6%, the lowest in 54 years. The projected inflation rate at this time next year will be 2.5%, normal based on historical trends. Under the previous administration, 3 million jobs were lost, including 300 million manufacturing jobs. That woke publication Fortune magazine said that under the Trump administration was the greatest job loss since Herbert Hoover. The United States economy is $23 trillion. It's nearly 1/4 of the world economy. U.S. Treasury bonds are the safest, most reliable investment in all the world. The U.S. dollar is the go-to currency in the world. 75% of U.S. bonds are owned by Americans, local banks, local businesses, local governments, Social Security, Medicare, and federal pensioners. America made a promise to its own people and the institutions who dared to invest in the country's economic growth. Again, these bonds are the safest investment in all the world. Why would you want to stiff your own people and destroy your own currency and destroy your own economy? The 14th Amendment, Section 4 of the United States Constitution is as clear as it can be. The validity of the public debt shall not be questioned. This is not a political negotiation. This is a moral and legal obligation to be honored. The budget is a law enacted by Congress, and that law is the debt ceiling. The U.S. needs to pay its obligations, and if Kevin McCarthy wants to petition the United States Supreme Court to allow the United States of America to default on its obligations to its own people for the first time in the United States history, that's on his speakership and on his party. We're a better country than that. Yes, there is a debt problem. I understand that. What is the contemporary historical example as to how you deal with debt? You deal with debt through growth of the economy. From 1992 to 2000, you had 4% economic growth each year sustained over an 8-year period. We didn't have a budgetary deficit. We had a $300 billion budgetary surplus. We paid $400 billion to reduce the overall debt. America is better than this. It is a constitutional obligation that we pay our debts, particularly when 75% of those are to our own people. When there is financial crisis in the nation, when there is financial crisis in the world, American debt and the investment in it is referred to as a flight to safety because it's a safe, sound economic investment. Mr. Gupta.
Well, I appreciate that, Representative Higgins. I'll just add by saying this is sort of the equivalent of taking out a mortgage. The bank knows you can pay for it, believes you can pay for it, is happy to give you the mortgage, and you come to them and you say, you know, I have a side agreement with my family that I'm just not going to pay. It doesn't make sense. We can have a good conversation about reducing debt, stabilizing debt, which, by the way, the president's budget does stabilize debt over time. But we should take off the table the threats to raising the debt limit itself because of the potential economic calamities. Obviously, there's constitutional questions, but I think it makes a lot of sense to look at including our military spending, which we've been told is going to be off the table under these caps. So we're looking at, instead, a very small slice of spending, mostly non-defense discretionary spending, and the biggest chunk of that is veterans' medical care, and that's being taken off the table from what we've heard as well. So that's a different conversation. But the U.S. economy, I want to note, has grown, and people are working. We actually have the highest employment to population ratio, which is now above the prior peak, on record except for the late 90s and 2000, when we also had a booming economy.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. We now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, my friend, Mr. McClintock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I agree with Mr. Higgins, which is why Republicans just voted to raise the debt limit by $1.5 trillion. But I remind him that if your family's spending itself into debt and you need to ask the bank for an increase in your credit card limit, you damn well better have a serious discussion about what's gotten you into this mess and make a plan to get out of that mess. That's what the Republican bill does. If the Democrats don't like it, they can strip all of the measures out in the Senate and send it back to us, and then it goes to conference and we have discussion, that family discussion. That's what this whole Capitol building is all about, discussing our differences and reaching a common direction on behalf of the American people. Now, to answer the ranking member, the term woke is not one of the right. It came from the left. It is a toxic combination of socialism and racism. And the reason that the left doesn't like it being used today is because it's already been discredited in the eyes of an overwhelming majority of Americans. I'm sorry, but his party has made that bed, and now they're going to have to sleep in it. Once again, I would warn him that you cannot spin the economy. Everybody knows how the economy is doing in their own lives, and trying to gaslight them never works. Whenever the left is taking control, you see the same economic pathologies: rampant homelessness, sky-high taxes, failing businesses, and ultimately fleeing families. I've seen that myself. I live in California, and if you just look at the census numbers, you can see what people believe is better for the environment to raise their families. What my Democratic colleagues don't seem to understand is that government cannot put a dollar into the economy that it first hasn't taken out of that same economy, and it can do so in only one of three ways that I know of. You either raise taxes, that reduces the current standard of living, it suppresses productivity. Borrowing, that crowds out to capital that would otherwise be available to loan to consumers to make consumer purchases or businesses to expand jobs. It incurs enormous interest costs, and ultimately it's got to be paid back anyway through future taxes, which reduces people's future standard of living. And then finally, you have inflation, pushing money into the economy that's unsupported by productivity, and that in turn reduces the value of the dollar and increases prices. Can any of our panelists tell me any other possible way government spending can be paid for? I guess it turns out all that free money isn't so free. It's actually very expensive, and people are paying it back every day at the gas station, at the grocery store, and in their paychecks. So the central question then is what we're spending. Now, we just heard that raising taxes to fund more social programs is sound policy. They always tell us that socialism is caring and sharing and taking care of each other, and capitalism is dog-eat-dog selfishness. They've got it completely backwards. There's only one way to prosper in a free society. You have to figure out what somebody else needs and figure out how to get it for them better than they can do it for themselves. That's true whether it's sweeping a floor or designing an advanced microchip. Socialism is taking what one person has made by helping others and giving it to someone who is not. It's true, if I take $1 from Peter and give it to Paul, Paul's got an extra $1 to spend, he's $1 better off. But Peter, of course, has $1 less to spend, and that's why socialism is so destructive, because you have now robbed both Peter and Paul of $1 of incentive to help each other. Peter, because he no longer profits by helping others, and Paul, because he no longer needs to. That is why socialism consistently produces poverty and misery wherever it's practiced. It destroys the natural incentives in a free society that encourages people to help each other the most efficient way that they can. And here's the rub. A free market is an amazingly democratic process because every consumer, every day, votes with every dollar they spend on what the economy will produce and what prices they're willing to pay. When government takes that dollar out of the economy, it transfers that decision from the consumer to the government. Instead of consumers deciding what they need, government makes that decision for them. So instead of using the dollar you've earned to support your family, government takes that dollar and spends it on an LGBT museum. Capital would otherwise go to its highest and best economic use, instead is used for its highest and best political use, something that is radically different. Mr. Ebel, what do subsidies do to stuff the economic ballot box and cause consumers to make inefficient decisions that they'd never make if they were getting accurate price information?
Thank you, Representative McClintock. That was an outstanding summary of how the economy works and what's wrong with government intervention and government taking taxes and spending it on things that don't create wealth. And I think Mr. Higgins mentioned that the economy grew at 4% in the 1990s. And that's because the policies were much closer to what you advocate than to what some others advocate. The economy was still benefiting from the Reagan tax cuts, the historic Reagan tax cuts. And I would point out that during most of the 1990s, the Republicans were in control of both the House and the Senate. So now, to say how...
Gentleman's time has expired. Appreciate the response, but we need to keep this moving. Mr. McClintock, thank you. And now I want to yield 5 minutes to Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm going to actually try and get a better understanding of woke, a word that actually I have never used in a sentence myself. But although I hear it a lot out there and heard it today, and unfortunately, I think it was also in the name of this hearing. But I have just yes or no questions for everyone of our witnesses, and maybe this will clarify our priorities. To me, it seems as if veterans have earned and deserve comprehensive health care. That's been a promise that we've made to veterans. And now we know that we do not have thousands and thousands of nurses that are needed for the Veterans Administration to take care of them. So my yes or no question is, do you think that hiring more nurses to provide for our veterans is woke and wasteful and bloated? Yes or no?
I can start and just say that I think that there need to be more nurses hired. One thing you could do first is to just not allow nurses who work at the Veterans Association to work for their unions instead of treating veterans.
So do you think that we should hire more nurses? I understand that you have qualifications to make sure that we...
First, you should use the nurses you have to treat veterans instead of to work for unions.
Can we go down the line?
It's not my issue area. Thank you.
Not necessarily.
Not at all. Not at all. And remember, nearly 1 million veterans also participate in Medicaid and could be caught up in the work reporting requirements of the
Okay, so I'm,
debt. So
that was, so, was your answer that it's not woke to take care of our veterans?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It could be woke, though.
Okay,
Happy to
thank
give you
you.
more details.
So there was recently recently we learned the Department of Labor found that there were 102 minors, children, who were working in very dangerous meat packing plants. They were doing some very dangerous work. So my question is, do you think that it is woke or wasteful to allow the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Labor to actually make sure and spend money to be able to make sure that we aren't having children that are working, some as young as 13, in dangerous workplaces? Yes or no?
No, I think that those laws need to be pursued to protect children, but also the border laws need to be enforced because a lot of those were stolen identities.
No, but I think you've added wasteful to woke, which raises new questions, so I
Well,
don't.
that was in the title of our hearing.
Yes,
This
but
is
you
about
wanted to
wasteful.
ask about woke, not, you've now
it's-
added wasteful. Wasteful and woke are two different issues.
Okay, my question is on woke and wasteful, the words that were in our hearing. Yes, do you think so?
I think the Department of Labor spends millions of dollars through all different kinds of programs, including Job
Should we
Corps.
protect child labor?
Should you protect child labor?
Children from doing dangerous child labor?
Yes, you shouldn't let children do dangerous child labor.
Is it woke to do that?
absolutely not.
Let me see my time. Well, it looks like I had a number of questions, but it seems to me that when we look at the important things that government regulation can do to make sure that our workers are safe, that our children are safe, that our railroad workers, which I was going to talk about, are safe, is very, very important. This is not about being woke. This is about being sensible and doing the right thing for our American people. And I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Illinois. Now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Contrary to what you're hearing today and what you might hear coming out of the White House press room, the fiscal state of our great nation is in desperate need of a reality check. And facing this looming fiscal crisis, House Republicans have risen to the occasion. We passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act, a package of fiscal reforms and pro-growth policies to protect the full faith and credit of the United States, but ensure that we will not accrue debt as we have over the past few decades. Without providing a solution of their own, the White House has resorted to false statements, alleging, for example, that the Limit, Save, Grow Act would cut veterans' benefits, despite there not being a single line in the bill to substantiate the claim. But while the president refuses to negotiate, the House Budget Committee is pushing forward to identify meaningful areas to reduce spending in a federal government that's growing increasingly, yes, woke and weaponized. Often overlooked as a source of potential savings, improper payments from government programs amounted to over $247 billion last year. That's nearly 15 times the total of this year's budget for Customs and Border Patrol. And as we know, there's a crisis in Customs and Border Patrol that is under-resourced, undermanned, and understaffed. Let me ask Ms. Gressler, this was a primary point made in your testimony. How is this able to happen year after year? How are we not able to get a handle on this?
There's simply no accountability. It doesn't matter how much in improper payments goes out the door. All that's done is there's a report, it's measured, it's sent in, nothing happens. you get more money. A lot of these are entitlement programs. They are entitled to get the dollars no matter what. And as I pointed out, in some cases, that means you have to take $1.46 to deliver $1 in benefits.
In one of the more egregious examples of improper payments in your testimony, you showed that more than 550 million claims for unemployment benefits went to people who were not unemployed. To what degree do you think that the rapid expansion of these benefits throughout the COVID pandemic played a part in this? And have you noticed any other contributing factors to increased rates of improper payments in your research?
Yeah, I think that the federal unemployment pandemic programs created a perfect storm. The state systems were already outdated, but then the federal government stepped in and they imposed these standards on the states that they could not follow through with. Essentially, anybody could qualify for an unemployment insurance benefit. You simply had to say, I've been affected by COVID-19. There were no income checks, and the impetus was told to the states, get the money out the door quickly, we'll check it afterwards. Well, we've seen what has happened is that they're not checking it afterwards, and it's very difficult to get the money back once it's out the door. One of the most egregious ones is the only one I can point to is a rapper in California who made a YouTube video called EDD for California's Employment Development Department, and he's sitting there with a video showing the stacks of EBT cards and saying, hey, you gotta go sell cocaine, all I gotta do is file a claim. So yes, they got him, but they're not getting the Chinese state-sponsored hackers, they're not getting the international crime rings, and so we're bringing in a couple million, maybe even $1 billion here and there, when $357 billion went to people who were not unemployed.
And it's having an impact on our ability to fight the international drug trade, secure our border, and any other number of important priorities of this government. Mr. Ebel, nonsensical climate regulations also present prime opportunities for reductions in spending. For example, the EPA received $10 billion for FY23 to enact regulations such as their new WOTUS rule that burdens farmers, and by proposing stringent tailpipe emission standards to target an overwhelming majority of passenger vehicles. Further, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy received $3.2 billion for FY23 to go after Americans' gas stoves, washing machines, refrigerators, light bulbs. How do these regulations impact an American's freedom to choose what they want to buy in an open market, and would the outcome of these regulations result in disparate impacts for low-income families?
Thank you, Representative Klein. I think you've raised a very important issue that deserves its own hearing. And I hope that you will be putting some riders in appropriations bills in your other committee assignment.
We're working on that.
Yes, all of these rules and regulations on efficiency standards on appliances, cars, furnaces, air conditioners are raising costs, which reduces people's choice because they find that they can't afford what they really want or need. When without the regulation, they would be able to afford it. So choice is a huge issue here, and I think the American people are getting fed up with all of the gas stove. The gas stoves hit a nerve, but so some years ago, Mr. Burgess knows, some years ago, so did the incandescent light bulb ban. So this has been going on a long time, and there's a lot of work to do here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like, if I could, Ms. Gressler, back in the old days, when Paul Ryan and I were on the Budget Committee, Heritage was very helpful in working with us, crafting some proposals to limit unnecessary agricultural subsidies. Is there still some interest in Heritage in exploring opportunities to save money there?
Absolutely. You know, a lot of our crop insurance subsidies are going to some of the wealthiest farmers. I think 10% go to the top 1% of farmers who have an average gross income of $1.5 million per year. Across the board, these subsidies are distorting the market, but absolutely you could put some income limits on those. And I'd also like to point out that a lot of those subsidies are going to farmers who are producing things 70% are to corn, soybean, and wheat, and not to the more nutritious foods.
Thank you. I appreciate I don't always agree 100% with the Heritage Foundation, but I really appreciate the intellectual honesty dealing with unnecessary subsidization. And some of these, as you point out, actually go to foreign companies. It's an area, Mr. Chairman, that I would hope that this committee could actually, when we get down to actually working on solutions, I hope this is an area that we can work across the aisle with a wide variety of philosophical positions that where the facts will lead us and save substantial money. And if we're worried, but some people are talking about limiting access to nutrition by having greater limitations. I had pointed out to this committee that there are almost 20,000 farmers who have received an average of $1 million a year on subsidies for 37 consecutive years. I think it's easier for us to deal with that than just going on, simply piling on regulations on poor people. I appreciate Mr. Norman talking about two worlds. Sometimes it's a little jarring if you just listen to what goes on here. We are in two different worlds. Unfortunately, the world of our economy and our finance is a little more reality-based. And they will punish us, and already have, if we're going to be reckless with dealing with our responsibilities. I think there are opportunities to be able to deal meaningfully with the deficit in ways that can actually bring people together rather than divide them. I think it's a good idea to actually collect taxes that are due and not paid. That's not a tax increase on anybody. It deals with the efficiency and fairness of our tax system. And there are hundreds of billions of dollars that could be collected if people remembered to report their income. I was taken by my colleague from Virginia's point that there's not a single line in this budget that speaks to a specific cut that the Republicans have advanced. That's right. That's why what has been offered is not a plan. There's no specific in terms of what they want to step up and do. There's just in the aggregate 22% reduction with all the exclusions that they're carving out. Well, that's not how you budget. You can't get away with that. You can't imagine those things away. I really think if we get down to things like border enforcement, air traffic control, Social Security, food safety, workplace safety, I mean, these are things you can't imagine away. They are specifics. There are costs associated. And if you're going to cut them 22% or more, there are real consequences. And that's why I would like us to circle back and deal with things, not wishing savings, but being specific. And the agricultural subsidies, I think, is something that is specific that we ought to be able to agree with. Collecting taxes that are already due and owing is fair to businesses who play by the rules. And I think we can get serious in terms of making some significant adjustment if we deal with these things that bring us together rather than divide us. Thank you very much.
I thank my friend from Oregon and would just say I'm always open to making sure incentives are responsible, no matter where they are in the marketplace or who they apply to, and that we reduce waste, no matter what the program or the constituency, agriculture included. So I thank the gentleman for his comments. I want to now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Bob Good, my friend from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of your witnesses and for your testimony, both written and expressed today. I do want to just start with Ms. Augustin, and I appreciate all the fine work done by CRA, and I appreciate your testimony regarding the current federal spending that is not simply unnecessary, unjustified, unconstitutional, or wasteful borrowing from our kids and grandkids, but it is actually, you made a very compelling case about so much of it that is literally harmful and intended to transform America into a Marxist globalist state, envisioned by the radical left that frankly hates the founders, hates the Constitution, and hates the basic ideals and values that are central to our country. The Limit, Save, Grow Act, or what I like to actually call Shrink Washington, Grow America, will take a meaningful, broad-based fiscal approach to top-line spending cuts, as you know, and some caps, and then some significant target eliminations of pet projects like climate, IRS expansion, COVID spending, and student loans. But I'd like just a few additional thoughts from you on how we would take a razor-sharp scalpel approach to the most egregious and harmful spending via the appropriations process this fall, or really as we work on it now to vote on it in the fall.
Thank you, Congressman Good, and I think you're exactly right. We've done a good job today talking about the financial crisis that is upon us, but there's another equally great crisis facing the American people, and that is the woke and weaponized government that's aimed squarely at them. So insofar as you do deal with the debt limit, you absolutely must maintain the $130 billion in cuts and find that from the woke and weaponized spending. And my advice to you would be look at the Department of Education and HHS, because what is happening to children in this country is the perfect display of what woke and weaponized government is doing to people. And when you send your kid to the public school systems, they have gay porn in the libraries. They have teachers that are asking them are you sure you're a boy or girl today, and changing their pronouns without their parents knowing about it, and then putting them on a path to radical gender affirmation, where you have cross-sex hormones and then eventually genital mutilation. And what that does to a child, and if you listen to the detransitioners, this will give you the perfect insight, is make them a permanent pharmaceutical patient for the rest of their life. There's no way for them to ethically consent to any of this, and this is being done in the schools without the parents' knowledge. This is why you have $3 million to Montessori schools to train 3-year-olds on anti-racism. Why would you need to tell a 3-year-old something about the color of their skin and divide them based oppressor versus oppressed, so that you put them on this path to adopting the woke ideology? And by the time they get to college, they can't even tell you what a woman is. So yeah, look at the Department of Education and HHS.
Well said, and you could expound so much more, as you know. And this is all with everyone's tax dollars, irrespective of their beliefs on it. The liberal progressive Bill Maher said when he was a child he wanted to be a pirate. He's glad no one poked out his eye and cut his leg off. And it's unbelievable we let children diagnose themselves and then adults perform this surgery to permanently maim and harm them accordingly. Ms. Gressler, President Biden has tried to say, hey, we're going to default if we don't raise the debt limit. I would just like your thoughts on the veracity of that claim that we would have a default. Isn't it true that it would just force prioritization of payments, and we'd only have a default if Treasury chose to have a default?
Yes, it's true that Biden and Treasury have the authority to prioritize those debt payments first to prevent a default.
Yeah, I led a letter with 10 of my colleagues to Secretary Yellen a couple of months back asking her, when are you going to run out of extraordinary measures? What's your plan to ensure we don't have a default, and how will you prioritize payments? And of course, she would not answer any of those questions because it defeats the narrative. But isn't Biden really afraid of defaulting on his radical agenda and his priorities of climate extremism, the Green Raw Deal, perpetuating COVID spending, expanding and empowering the IRS, promoting, again, the things that Ms. Augustin has spoken to so eloquently this morning?
Yes, I think that it just points out that you would have to make those difficult choices. And when you look at things like one of the president's own actions that added $5.4 billion in additional costs to taxpayers for taxpayer-financed select private union pension plans, which, by the way, sent $36 billion to one single union pension plan on January 12th, 5 days before the U.S. hit the debt limit. And so you can see the types of things that might have to be at least delayed.
Well, thank you. My time is out, but I will tell Ms. Augustin, we've got 500 targeted cuts that my colleagues and I have sponsored already to deal with the appropriations process. And the Dems, Ms. Gressler, will not, they will end up signing and agreeing to limit, save, grow because it would force $100 billion a month in cuts rather than the $131 billion over the course of a year. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Good. The gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the panel. First of all, let me just say to my colleagues, you all have a warped definition of woke. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines woke as aware of and actively attentive to important societal facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice. In other words, it's basic decency. It means treating all Americans fairly, regardless of their skin color, background, religion, or gender identity. And I should know, because they actually quoted me in that definition of woke from a speech that I gave. And I said, but we will succeed if we reject the growing pressure to retreat into cynicism and hopelessness. We have a moral obligation to yes, stay woke, take a stand, and be active, challenging injustices and racism in our communities and fighting hatred and discrimination wherever it rises. So as an African American, your testimony, Ms. Augustine, scares me to death because you said, based on your definition of woke, that we won't have a country left. We won't have a country left. If in fact, we want a country that ensures equality for all. That's outrageous. That's what America stands for. Mr. Gupta, let me just ask you about the value of the federal government and the American taxpayer investing in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and how these investments lead to equal opportunity for everyone in this democracy where every American should have a shot to the American dream, where you know, and all of you know, that marginalized people in this country, people of color, poor people, don't have that path to the American dream.
Thank you, Representative Lee, for the question and your contributions to this discussion. And I appreciate you bringing up what I think should be a shared principle. Let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. At the time, they meant it in an exclusive way, but they wrote all men are created equal. If you believe that today, and you see that based on group identity and other lived experiences, these extraordinary disparities, for example, that a median white household has 8 or 9 times the wealth of a typical black household in this country. And if you believe that our systems are fair, then how could we see those outcomes, right? Does anyone here believe that merit varies by race, that ability varies by race? I don't think anyone here believes that. So what we know is, sometimes unintentionally, but sometimes very knowingly, we do have a lot of disparities by race. And educating people like my 6-year-old and my 10-year-old about this history, about just basic facts, actually helps bring them together. It actually helps them understand each other. It helps build a multiracial, vibrant democracy that will allow us to compete with other countries rising throughout the world, that will allow us to have the strength of everyone's talent and potential.
Thank you very much, and let me ask you very quickly about the Default on America Act in terms of the harm that this could wreak on the American people. In fact, let me just give you a couple of facts. In Speaker McCarthy's own district, mind you, these cuts would jeopardize Social Security payments for 75,000 people. That's in our Speaker's district, would risk the health benefits of 285,000 people in Speaker McCarthy's district. It would threaten the retirement savings of 89,000 people in Speaker McCarthy's district. And this is just 1-year impact of these cuts. Can you speak more on the long-term impact of these cuts?
Yes, I appreciate the question, Representative Lee. And I'll just add that this underscores that prioritization of debt service payments over everything else is still default. You're defaulting on the American people, on promises, on obligations that have been made to them, that they can count on right now, that they have been able to count on. So the consequences could be tremendous. In the long run, undermining our credit rating and the ability for the United States government to borrow as freely as it can right now. I just want to remind folks that there is no bank, there is no one telling us that we can't borrow. We're only telling ourselves that. In fact, people are readily willing and able to help us finance our investments because they know that the American economy has been so dynamic, so successful for so long, will continue to in the future. So this would simply be an own goal that would harm us potentially for decades to come.
Thank you. And just for the record, in my own state of California, not specifically Speaker McCarthy's district, which we just went through, which I just went through, the whole state of California, if in fact these budget cuts were enacted, we'd have 2.6 million people at risk of losing Medicaid coverage. We'd eliminate preschool and child care for at least 35,000 children and reduce access to outpatient care at Veterans Affairs medical facilities by approximately 2.3 million visits. So these are impacts on people's daily lives. These aren't just statistics. These are real everyday challenges that people are gonna will have if in fact these cuts are enacted. So what are they gonna do? How do you see their lives?
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Okay, well, thank you, and I'll submit the question for the record.
Thank you.
And get a response. Thank you very much.
I'll next yield myself 5 minutes. Thanks to each of the witnesses for being here and giving us your insights and your valuable time. We're grateful for that. I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and they talk about the resilience of the American economy, and we're doing better than Europe. We're doing better than other areas. And I think the foundation of that is based in the fact that with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we created a vibrant economy where it made America the most advantageous place in the world to invest, to manufacture, and to sell around the world. And the things that have made this economy very, very resilient, and even to the point that they've been able to withstand the massive amount of public spending, is the fact that we have made American business and Americans competitive, and we've made them more competitive than other places in the world. And so I just want to say that, yes, I agree the American economy is resilient, and I do think that it's a direct result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that have allowed Americans to invest in their people, American business to invest in their people, and to invest in their systems, and to become more efficient so we can win around the world. Now, with that backdrop, we are seeing some things happen that are eroding even the greatness of the American economy right now. You know, when I look at, and Mr. Duda Gupta, with my Southern accent, I hope I said that correctly. You said that corporate America should pay its fair share, correct? And yet with the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill, we see green energy tax credits that now we're going to go to the level of about $1.2 trillion, and about 90% of those are going to go to the very corporations that you want to pay you want to pay their fair share of the taxes. So you're going to then, what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have done is given a massive tax break to the wealthiest corporations to advance their own agenda. Mr. Ebell, does that sound right? Am I off base with that?
There are many ironies involved in the position of the taxers and spenders. You have revealed one. In fact, a huge amount of the federal budget is devoted to giving handouts to corporate special interests and rewarding the people who have the right agenda. This is a real drag on the American economy, and it depresses ultimately investment by private individuals in businesses that could actually create jobs and create wealth. So yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ebell. Next I want to go to something, as we've talked about this debt limit right now and what's happening. It's amazing to me that the Biden administration continues to go down the road of forgiving student loan debt. Ms. Gressler, can you draw out a diagram of what happens when, for this latest tranche, $42 billion, who actually pays for that $42 billion? Because currently, right now, students and American workers that have those loans, about 17% of the folks in the country, are responsible for paying that back. As soon as that's wiped off the books, explain to us how that impacts the rest of the taxpayers and the debt, if you would.
Well, it's already affecting the debt, caused us to approach the debt limit sooner, and will cause us to run out of money in extraordinary measures sooner, because we're going on 3 years now that people who hold those student loans have not been required to make any payments on them. So continuing to do that is just pushing us closer to that limit.
Okay, so as we are then having to, because once you take the mandatory spending side out of the equation, and then you defend the nation, which is our number one responsibility, we're basically borrowing money for everything else. So we are going to borrow more money to pay off the debt, and then we're going to pay a higher interest rate on that, which is going to exacerbate the problem, which means that we're not going to be able to take care of our most vulnerable, and at some point it's going to drive into Social Security and Medicare. Is that a fair
Yes,
statement?
and if we want to protect the most vulnerable people, then we should be at least asking those who have the highest incomes, those who have achieved a college degree, to pay back the money that they borrowed.
Thank you. One final thing, a lot of discussion here on the definition of woke. People can make it up and do whatever they want to with it, say however they want to with it. Bottom line, I can tell you what American people don't want. They don't want the federal government or other entities telling them how to think, what to think, and why to think, and they especially don't want they don't want their tax dollars being used for that purpose. With that, I will yield back. Next, I will call on my colleague from Texas, Mr. Doggett. You are now recognized.
Thank you very much. With the clock ticking on the few days that are remaining to avoid the Republican default on America and the severe economic consequences that will result from failing for the first time in American history to uphold our full faith and credit of the country, this gathering occurs about the woke and the wasteful. Well, I think the real waste here is the waste of time in the Republican willingness to follow the call of President Trump just last night to drive our economy off the cliff. Instead of their much ballyhooed promised budget, they offer us today talk about woke policies. They don't really know what woke means, but it sounds a little bit black, and it appeals to the white nationalists who are so important in their base as they send a message, a signal that they don't want to do anything about historic injustices to people of color. Well, before it's too late, we need Republicans to wake up to the reality, to be aware, to get woke about the true dangers of default, to overcome their fear of providing this committee a budget that outlines the specific cuts that they're demanding to educational opportunity, to environmental law enforcement, to dealing with contaminated food and contaminated air and water, to secure our border, and to counter the growing influence of China. The Republican failure to present the budget that they had promised is not an accident. It's a vital strategy. As one of our colleagues just said this morning, there's not a single line in their bill that cuts veterans' health care. It's just that the effect of their bill is to cut that very health care by about 22% or greater, and it is deliberately hidden. They recognize that if they expose specific cuts like that, they will be rejected by the American people. So without a budget, both Representative Arrington, our chairman, and Speaker McCarthy can engage in a rhetorical sleight of hand, implying that they will not be making these devastating cuts. All they're going to do is return the spending to the level of last October. Well, it is a sleight of hand because we recognize that fiscal year 22 spending levels were set back in 2021, and we're now talking about 2024 spending 3 years later. And there's been a little inflation since then. They don't want to apply that policy to national security because they recognize it would not provide the level of security our country needs. But they are so eager to apply it to healthcare security and educational security that are so very important to our country. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Arrington, I would have a great deal more confidence in your stated claim of restoring fiscal sanity if you had not already committed yourself, along with many of your Republican colleagues, to actually exploding our deficit and our national debt. You're sponsoring yet another massive tax cut that is estimated to cost about $2 trillion or more. And that's the same approach that got us into this mess in the first place, helping those at the very, very top of the economic ladder and adding more and more debt to, as you've done in the past. It was George W. Bush who took us off the course that President Clinton had set with a balanced budget and a path to reducing the debt. Then his failed war in Iraq, so costly in lives and in trillions of dollars, all done on borrowed money. Then the Trump tax giveaway. After their embrace of Trump, the self-described king of debt, they raised the debt limit 3 times. They found now interest in debt that seems, their newfound interest in debt today seems more aimed at destroying health, education, and environmental law enforcement that they never supported in the first place. Let me just ask you, Mr. Dutta-Gupta, what will be the effect on college students if, as you say, the cuts could be even as much as 33% if the Republican Default on America Act is adopted?
Thank you, Representative Doggett. That's a great question. As you said, we have to make a bunch of assumptions here to figure out how this would work. But if we do assume that there is a cut of that size, that means that low-income students in particular would have limited access to college. There's a number of grants and funding streams that help them afford college, which, by the way, has gotten increasingly expensive. Most of the folks in this room probably didn't have to face the cost of college that people do today. So it would undermine our future. It would undermine our ability to grow a strong workforce that can compete with the rest of the world.
Thank you.
I'm 10 seconds away from seizing power, so.
Yeah, Alexander Haig. Recognize Mr. Roy from Texas.
Well, thank you, Chairman Haig. I appreciate that. Ms. Gressler, let me ask you a question. True or false, we currently are bringing in about 19.6% of GDP in terms of revenues into the Treasury right now.
Correct.
So this idea that somehow that the tax problem is the problem is completely absurd, correct?
Yes, historical levels of revenue are actually lower, 2 percentage points lower than we're bringing in now.
And right now we are at levels that are basically have only been matched 2 other times in history, World War II and in 2000 right after the dot-com explosion, correct?
Correct.
In other words, it is a complete lie to say that tax policy is causing the problem that we have with respect to deficit spending right now. Rather, it is a spending problem. True?
Correct. Taxes are significantly higher. It's the problem that spending is about 5 percentage points higher than GDP than typical, 25% versus a little over 20%.
Correct. And the reason we're having the hearing we're having today is because we have an explosion of the federal bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that is at odds with the well-being of the American people by empowering bureaucrats to go after them. For example, putting a man in prison for building ponds on his ranch in a state in West Texas. Is that not, in the Western United States. Is that not right, Ms. Ignostin?
Yes, I think the problem is when the size of government gets bigger and we're talking about American exceptionalism, that has been because typically America's taken less from individuals and businesses.
Right, and Ms. Ignostin, is that correct about what's happened to this man who went to jail because of what happened out there with the EPA?
I'm not familiar with that.
Right, sorry.
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Rory.
Right. Okay, and so we've got the Secretary, Yellen, calling president's budget a fiscally responsible proposal and said Republicans want to focus on cutting spending. Yes, guilty. We'd like to cut spending. Year one, our bill would cut the deficit in year one by over $1 trillion, yet President Biden's budget would increase spending next year by $500 billion to $6.8 trillion and increase the deficit by $300 billion. 10 years, our bill would cut the deficit by $4.8 trillion. The president's budget reduces the deficit by hiking taxes by $4.7 trillion, causing out-year decreases in spending through taxes. Yellen says our spending reforms are draconian. We are simply cutting top-line discretionary spendings to 2022 levels. And if we do that, we can keep our non-defense discretionary at the same level as that MAGA extremist Barack Obama proposed for FY24 in his final budget. Literally the same as that MAGA extremist Barack Obama. You know, that draconian pre-COVID bureaucracy, that pillar of efficiency and effectiveness of bureaucracy before COVID, if we return the spending to that somehow is going to leave the American people without the ability to function. Completely and patently absurd. Leveling charges of cuts against VA is a page out of the Democratic playbook we've all seen far too well, where they want to scare the American people, say that somehow these great experts in Washington, if they don't come to their defense, that they are going to starve on the streets. But the fact of the matter is, the American people prosper best when the federal government's woke bureaucracy, weaponized bureaucracy, wasteful bureaucracy gets the hell out of the way of the American people. What I would say is that the most egregious problem with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is that they say that our plan will hurt the poor and minorities. But is it not true that we repeal Biden's $80 billion IRS expansion, the IRS which the New York Times reported? I would ask Mr. Duda Gupta, do you not agree that the New York Times reported that black taxpayers are at least 3 times as likely to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service as other taxpayers? Do you know that the New York Times reported that, yes or no?
Yeah, absolutely. And more IRS resources would let them redirect their
And that
focus to
CBS
the bigger tax gap
and that
from
CBS
S corporations and
reported,
partnerships.
reclaiming my time, that CBS IRS audits the poor at 5 times the rate of everyone else, as the analysis finds. The fact of the matter is, it's absurd, the attacks on our responsible effort that the president is ignoring. The rich, Biden claims that we want to cut spending so we can, quote, cut taxes for the rich. But is it not true, Mr. Abel, that 78% of the electric vehicle tax credits that claimed by the filers making $100,000 or more per year, and we repeal that, a tax for the rich, true?
Yes, Representative Roy. The problem with the subsidies is that they go to people who already own 2 or 3 vehicles, and they want another one because it's fashion.
And that 90% of the green energy tax subsidies, which we repeal, go to corporations that make over $1 billion per year, not to mention Chinese companies. True?
I believe that's true, yes.
Right. This is the truth. The American people know it. Our Democratic colleagues passed the biggest giveaway to the rich that we've seen in years last August in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. They are the party for wealthy corporations and elites. We are the party for hardworking Americans. We're trying to get the government out of the way to improve their lives, and that's what we're going to do despite Biden's resistance.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I admit a part of this hearing I appreciate because it is on an issue that is important to me, and that's obviously improving the functioning of our government bureaucracy. I think all of us, I don't care what side of the aisle that you're on, all of us want to make the federal government work for our constituents. Now, I think we can also all admit that there are numerous examples where our bureaucracy is wasteful and duplicative, and yes, can be better streamlined. For example, I was pleased that this administration put out a permitting reform objective to get infrastructure and energy projects built faster and give taxpayers more bang for their buck, and believe we must work together on this front. Now, we have to have serious conversations. Of course, we can be serious about spending, and yes, we need to be serious about revenues as well. And we can start by marking up a budget resolution in this committee. I was critical of my own party's failure to do this, and I won't let this majority off the hook either. Now, I hope we can get some real discussion about how to improve our bureaucracy, and of course, like I said, make the federal government work for our constituents. Now, there are areas in which we can reduce waste. The Government Accountability Office releases a report annually highlighting opportunities to reduce fragmentation, overlap, and duplication in federal programs, as well as chances to save money and increase revenue. The GAO has found that tens of billions of dollars can be saved if we took actions to reduce fragmentation and duplication. To the government's credit, agencies have taken GAO's recommendations to save additional funding. Now, many of the GAO's recommendations include investments in programs to improve the administration, service, and track overpayments, but note that in some of these cases, spending money actually reduces cost. Mr. Duda Gupta, are there areas where a little more investment can make a program work better and more efficiently?
Absolutely, Representative Panetta, and in fact, one of the things that's missed by the focus on improper payments is how many people who could benefit from a program also don't access them. So we can do a lot better. And I'll just note that there is a lot of government spending that absolutely has a return on investment for American taxpayers. That includes especially the American Rescue Plan's child tax credit expansion, which has a 9-to-1 return on investment, which if we would talk about a business person or someone in the private sector, you wouldn't hesitate to make a virtually guaranteed 9-to-1 return on investment. But we got to get those programs back. We lost some of those, and make sure that everyone gets them so we could make programs a lot more effective and efficient.
Great. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, I had some constituents in my office yesterday, and they have been having a difficult time dealing with one of our favorite bureaucracies, the FAA. And what they noticed is that there's been sort of a brain drain at the FAA, in that basically there is sort of high turnover causing a major slowdown in their aircraft certifications. And what we're seeing is that more experienced staffers are replaced with less experienced staffers. In other cases, they have to get up to speed on a project all over again, wasting the efforts of the previous staffer. Heck, I've seen this not just with the FAA, but the Army Corps of Engineers as well. So the issue, like I said, isn't limited to one bureaucracy, and it can impact agencies that serve people in every part of government. So what can we do to ensure that we have well-staffed agencies that work effectively and efficiently and, like I said, help make the federal government work for our constituents, Mr. Dutta-Gupta?
Yeah, there's a lot we can do, and there are other agencies, as you pointed out, including the Social Security Administration, which is struggling with workload as our population ages and needs human beings to interact with to get their benefits. But one of the things we should do is not arbitrarily and preemptively limit sort of across the board our non-defense discretionary spending. But we can do a lot more to make government work more attractive. And remember, if there is a default here, government employees will also suffer with wages not paid. So we need to do a lot more to recruit, to continue to staff adequately, and that will improve the experiences that the American people have interacting with our government.
Let's hope so. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Our job in the federal government is to protect taxpayer dollars and ensure that they are used responsibly and effectively. But President Biden seems to have lost sight of that fact. The fact that every single dollar that is spent by the government is a dollar that was taken from the American people through taxes. And it's less money that Americans get to use for a down payment on a house, to put food on their table, and sending their kids to college. The Biden administration's complete disregard for taxpayer dollars is illustrated in its never-ending plans to increase government spending with zero accountability. Today, I want to begin my focus on the government's staggering amount of improper payments. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office estimates that in 2021, fiscal year 21, the federal government made $247 billion of improper payments. If improper payments were its own line in the federal budget, it would be the 6th largest line behind Social Security, Medicare, National Defense, Medicaid, and interest on our debt. But it gets worse. The Government Accountability Office also states, and I quote, "This estimate is likely understated since it doesn't include improper payments related to COVID-19 funding." The Department of Labor's Inspector General estimates that improper payments for pandemic unemployment programs accounted for $191 billion. And outside experts estimate that it could be as high as $400 billion. I'm glad that the House is considering the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act, which incentivizes states to investigate and recover fraudulent unemployment insurance claims. My first question for Mrs. Gressler, regarding the reported amount found that 1 in 5 Medicaid payments were improper. A business would never survive if 1 in 5 checks sent out were in error. A family would never make it financially if 20% of the bills they paid were in error. How do improper payments of this size, how are they permitted to continue year after year?
There's no consequence for having those improper payments. They simply can continue to go on and to just collect the funding because it's an entitlement.
Do you think that the federal government has taken any meaningful steps to reform improper payments and hold our federal agencies accountable for the improper payments that take place?
No.
Why not, from your perspective?
There are some recommendations. They've largely gone ignored, but there is no accountability. What is their incentive to do that? The money will be there no matter what if they send the improper payments. And in some places, it's difficult to impose the consequences if it is an entitlement because you would be taking away from something that they have a legal authority to. But that's where I think we need to impose accountability on the states, especially in those programs that are administered through the states.
All right, thank you. Also, Ms. Gressler, there are dozens of instances where the federal government has duplicative programs and offices. In 2022 alone, the GAO identified 16 new instances of overlap between federal programs. Would you agree that duplicative federal programs are a clear illustrator that our bureaucracy, our federal bureaucracy, has gotten out of control?
Absolutely, and that's also a disservice to the individuals those programs are supposed to help because they don't know which door to walk into.
Yeah, and I want to just cite a few examples of some of these duplicative government programs that have just recently been uncovered. For example, there are 21 federal agencies that have programs related to the role of diet in Americans' risk of chronic health conditions. There are 5 federal agencies who research alternate technologies for radioactive materials. The Department of Interior has 3 separate systems that separately collect data on oil and gas development. There are 3 different programs at the Department of Justice that investigate law enforcement's use of force. And the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Treasury both have programs regarding trade-based money laundering. All of these are programs that should be funded, but at the same time, we shouldn't have so many duplicative programs and so many people in our federal government that are doing the same thing and doing the same job. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Bloated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States cannot become a deadbeat nation. We've never failed to pay our bills, and to do so now would have dire consequences on American families, including the ones living in my district in Vermont. As my colleagues have noted, we never had a hearing or a markup on HR 2811. We never got a budget. All we've got is this vague plan that was passed, and we have to try to make sense of that. So let's take a look at that. The Republican bill would potentially cut funding to low-income students at a time when we're talking about allowing people to get ahead. As a former teacher, I can tell you that cutting $4 billion for schools that serve 26 million low-income kids is going to lead to a cascade of negative impacts for those millions of kids and their families. The Republican bill would slash mental health supports for students. And at a time when we can all agree that we have a mental health crisis in this country, we should be investing more in this area and not making cuts. The Republican bill would also make college more expensive. A 22% budget cut would likely eliminate Pell Grants altogether. And it would reduce the maximum award by nearly $1,000 for the remaining recipients. So we should be making college, again, more affordable, not less affordable for regular families. And the list goes on in this vague plan that nobody will allow us to, put our finger on exactly what's going on in here. They left it intentionally vague. As a former teacher and as a parent, this is very alarming to me. Mr. Duda Gupta, can you highlight for us what the impact of the Republican cuts would be on America's public schools?
Thank you, Representative Fallon. And I'll just start by noting, as you did, that we have a serious youth mental health crisis in this country. Nearly 1 in 6 youth ages 12 to 17 reported experiencing a major depressive episode in the past year. Among teen girls in 2021, the data show that nearly 1 in 3 seriously considered attempting suicide. And without adequate support for students and teachers, these statistics are only going to get worse. And unfortunately, we see cuts, as you mentioned, also to higher education. including Pell Grants, which are very well targeted, overwhelmingly to folks with lower and moderate incomes. Nearly 97% go to students in households with family incomes at or below $60,000 a year in 2020 and 2021. So that's well below the median income in the United States. And this will also hurt our public institutions, our public 2-year and 4-year colleges and institutions. But I will just sort of finally note that this is really undermining our nation's prosperity, because we know that these are investments. They are investments. Wherever you believe the money comes from, they absolutely do have a return on investment. So I really hope that folks can come together in Congress and understand that this non-defense discretionary category of spending has lots of critical funding.
Thank you so much. I am deeply concerned about all of our students. That's why I ran for office. That's why I serve. And again, I will stress about all of our students. I just want to mention something that is deeply troubling to me. A Republican witness earlier noted a few federal programs that support LGBTQ people, including kids. And as a member of that community, it's really disappointing to me that my Republican colleagues seem to delight in attacking the LGBTQ people and their families and blaming us for all things, including now, it turns out, the deficit. So I just want to put this in perspective. Yesterday, I met for an hour with parents of trans kids from across this nation, and they came from all over, from conservative districts and states, just regular families. Parents came to share their experiences of what it's like in this moment. And you know what I heard over and over again? Why are members of our own government scapegoating us and our children? Why have we become the favorite enemy when we just want the same things that all American families want? We want to live safe, fulfilling lives, and we want to support and love and protect our children. It is morally bankrupt and deeply un-American to continue to attack these kids. It's time to do our job and pass a budget that supports and protects all of our kids, all of our constituents. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. McLean, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. I've listened to everyone, and I appreciate your comments and opinions. I want to start with one simple question, because we have a deficit. We're up against the debt limit, correct? And what we're asking is, can we tighten our belt a little bit? The president, right, I don't want to negotiate, right? I want to pass a clean debt ceiling. Is there anyone on this panel that thinks the government runs so efficiently that there's not $1 we can save? So everyone's in agreement. Okay. All right. Just for the record, everyone agrees that there's probably a few efficiencies that we could find. So what I find troubling, disheartening, and if it wasn't factual, kind of comical, is what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to cut. The fear-mongering is hilarious if it wasn't true. So one of my colleagues, Appropriations Ranking Member Rosa DeLoria, sent a letter to the agencies, right? Asking them what cuts would look like in their department, right? Okay, so let me use my family. Hey, my husband comes home, hey, Lisa, we're way over maxed out on our credit cards. We have got to make some cuts. What I say is, you know what? Okay, great. I have 4 kids. I'm just not feeding them. Now, I'm still getting my nails done. I'm still going to the gym. And my God, I am not discontinuing my wine subscription. The kids, they cannot eat. I mean, you would never do that. But that's exactly what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are doing. And let me give you some specific examples. So, the Ag Secretary, Tom Visilak, said we would cut $1.4 billion of cuts to WIC. That's where your priority is? The first thing we're gonna cut is WIC, by God. Now, forget about the 1.5 billion in tree planting. Nope, we're gonna cut WIC. We're saving those trees. Okay, let me give you another one. Secretary Buttigieg, who's just done a phenomenal job, and I say that with quite sarcasm, says, if this budget that the Republicans pass, here's what we would cut. FAA, $2.6 billion in air traffic controllers. That's the first thing we're gonna cut. Because, you know, anybody who's flown, everything's on time and nothing runs late, right? That's the first thing we're gonna cut. Well, I have another idea. Instead of cutting my food, I would go to maybe, let's say, $1.9 billion that the FAA spends on heat island hotspots. Not sure what that is. Or gaps in tree canopy coverage. So let's put people at risk, but let's make sure we protect regional greenways. Not sure what that is. My point here is if you truly want to care about the American people and truly want to get your fiscal house in order so we can actually protect American citizens, actually protect our most needy, actually protect our most children, stop with the fear-mongering. Because the first place we shouldn't go is none of the children are gonna eat. Well, when the first opportunity that the Democrats have in these agencies, appointed by this administration, start with the fear-mongering on, oh my gosh, none of the kids are gonna eat. What I would suggest is why don't we let the children eat and maybe plant a few less trees. I'm not saying trees aren't important, but if you ask me, do I care about the children eating, especially the underprivileged children, or planting trees? I'm gonna tell you what I'm gonna pick every day of the week and twice on Tuesday. I'm not gonna start with the kids. So I'm curious, is that where you all would start?
If I could just say real quickly here, I think that the American people want to know if they're going to have $11,500 per household in new debt taken out for 1 year alone. They want to have a responsible plan to know that the next year it might be at least a little less than $11,500. And I think that if we put it to the rating agencies to say, what is going to be the better path forward? Are you going to downgrade or upgrade? That they would pick a plan that is responsible and sets at least modest limits over something that is just clean debt limit increase.
Do you think it makes a difference if it's your money or others people's money?
Absolutely.
Because I find it interesting that these agencies, the first thing they do is attack the most vulnerable. I find that very disheartening. And I don't know why they do it. I really don't, other than fear-mongering. And if we want to get back to some serious talk and budget negotiations so we can provide for the next generation, we have to have some honest talks. And that's where I think we're at. You can't say, oh my gosh, we're gonna cut veterans' benefits by 22%. Where in the plan does it say that? I can't point to one line. Not one line. Yet that's the first place we should go. Maybe.
The gentlelady should conclude.
Thank you, sir.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of comments about some things that have been said. First of all, the Trump tax cut led to economic development. First of all, the Trump tax cut led to a disaster at the end of the Trump administration. The American Rescue Plan came in, and that's when the jobs came back. And I get tired of being lectured by Republicans on the budget deficit. This chart shows that every presidential administration Democratic administration since Kennedy left for their Republican successors a better deficit situation than they inherited, and every Republican presidential administration since Nixon left for their Democrats a worse deficit situation than they inherited, all without exception. Trump was on the way to doing that before the pandemic, and President Biden has already improved the budget since then. Now, Mr. Dutta-Gupta, you started to answer a question about why there was a discrepancy on who gets audited by taxes, and I think you were going to say that they don't have the money to actually go after wealthy people, and that's what the money can be used for. Is that right?
That's right. Right now, it's too easy and encouraged for the IRS to go after the poorest people, including communities of color, when they need a much stronger staffing and almost an army to go up against the armies that wealthy corporations who are responsible for most of our tax gap, by the way, meaning taxes owed that are not paid.
Now, people are trying to make this a spending problem. Where would we be if there had not been a Bush and Trump tax cuts? If they had not passed, where would we be on this budget chart?
Yeah, we'd be, including the Bush tax cut extensions, $10 trillion better off.
$10 trillion better off. Would be back to the Clinton days where we'd be almost in surplus. Is that right?
Yeah.
But for the tax cuts. Now, you mentioned on this thread on the debt ceiling that the interest rates might go up. What does that mean to mortgages?
Yeah, it makes much less affordable for people to own homes, start businesses.
Like a $200,000 mortgage, 1% would be $2,000 extra every year.
Yeah.
For each percentage we go up, car notes, credit cards. What would that mean for a 30-some trillion dollar debt per percent? What would it cost the budget?
What would it cost the budget if the debt?
If the interest rates go up 1%?
Yes, that's a major driver of increasing debt service costs, actually. So it could be
So
$100 billion.
$300 billion
yeah.
per percent. So if it goes up 2 or 3%, you're into 6, 9, maybe $1 trillion worth of additional interest because they're fooling with the debt ceiling. We've heard a lot about these vague, illusory cuts. Everybody's talking about it in general. I think it's been pointed out that veterans, there's no specific cut for veterans. There's no specific cut for anything. As a matter of fact, every time you say something's going to get cut, oh, we're not going to cut that. Do you cut the budget in general, or do you actually have to cut something? And we haven't heard any specific target of any meaningful. I mean, the 1% increase in interest will take place because of the debt ceiling fiasco. Could be $300 billion. We've heard a couple of $100 million here and $1 billion here. They're not even going to be able to cover the debt service that they cause unless they start getting specific and talk about a budget. Is that right?
Yes, and the data that have been discussed are across the board. It's not where the agency said they would go first. It's assuming across the board cuts.
And if you protect Social Security, Medicare, defense, veterans, what do you have to do to the others?
You get close to having to eliminate the rest.
Let me ask Ms. Augustine, you talked about the education, you want to cut the education budget. If we get away from the culture wars and just talk about the budget, what part of the Department of Education would you want to cut?
I would cut all of the training programs that are teaching teachers to radicalize kids, the social emotional learning, cultural
How much are you
responsive.
How much are you talking about?
30% at least.
30% of the training or 30% of the Department of Education?
Get rid of the SEED program, get rid of the.
How much money are you talking about?
$60 million for SEED.
60 million?
For that
We're
one
talking about,
program.
and we're talking, trying to get hundreds of billions?
I'm not saying that's the only thing. I told you that every single training program, do you know how many training programs are at the Department of Education for training teachers?
We only spend a few $billion in training generally.
Okay, so all of that training is now being done through the lens of woke
So
ideology.
how much
and you should not
money
spend
would
that
you
money
cut from, how
anymore.
much money would you cut from the Department of
I
Education?
told you 30%
How much money are you talking, 30% of what?
of their budget.
Of the whole budget?
Well, the congressman earlier said that the whole entire government is 40% bigger now than it was before COVID.
Well, I'm trying to get a straight
So
answer. How much money are
The straight
you
answer is
talking
I'm
about?
saying you should trim the Department of Education's budget by 30%.
I think
Cut it
30% has to be the final
to
answer. Gentleman's time has
2019%.
expired. You can submit further questioning in writing.
Well, I just want to point out that the total Department of Education is a couple of $100 billion, and she's talking about 1% of a little bit.
Again,
We're trying to
gentleman's-
balance, and we're trying to balance.
Gentleman's
the
time has
budget.
expired, and the problem is, it's now my time, so you're encroaching upon me, and that I can't allow that. And I appreciate that observation of the 30%. I mean, and as Ms. Grenzler pointed out earlier, on the Medicaid dollars that are just being spent, crank continues to turn, the dollars continue to go out the door at an interest rate that is now higher than what it was 2.5 years ago. Mr. Gupta, the interest rate, and Mr. Scott was asking about the interest rate. The interest rate has what over the last 2.5 years?
Due to the Federal Reserve actions, has risen significantly.
Yes, and the Federal Reserve action was in response to what, Mr. Ebel?
Inflation.
Well, and as a result of federal spending.
Spending, oh, yes.
Which is what we're here talking about today. Look, and I know this ground has all been covered extensively. I did want to ask Ms. Grenzler, we're right at the end of the public health emergency, thank God. It's going to end midnight tonight. A figure that I'm hearing is that 18 million people will lose Medicaid tomorrow morning. Is that accurate?
I haven't seen that, and I don't know any reason why they would lose their coverage.
Yeah, and that's just it. These numbers get inflated and socialized, they're repeated until they're just now derived as fact when, as you've pointed out on several occasions this morning, that the purported cuts to veterans, for example, purported cuts to other healthcare programs, in fact, are not what has been included in the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. Is that correct?
Correct. There are no specific cuts to these, but if you do want to drill down to getting at protecting veterans, you can absolutely protect veterans, and you don't have to have any cuts, and you can actually still save money because 11% of all the payments that are coming out of the VA are improper payments. One of their programs has an 80% improper payment rate. You're paying 5 times as much for long-term care services as veterans as you need to be. So you can save money and still provide quality care.
And every dollar that's not well spent in the program deprives some other veteran of a service that they may need or increases their time on a waiting list. Is that not correct?
Correct.
Mr. Ebel, let me ask you a question. Title 42 is in all the news. There's a different Title 42. In the HHS had developed a different payment rate for some of their scientists. The Special Pay Authority, originally given by Congress to the Department of Health and Human Services, but EPA also used to be a part of the Department of Health and Human Services, so they've sort of continued that special pay authority that they have under the Public Health Service Act. Are you aware of this special pay authority that the EPA possesses?
Representative Burgess, I am vaguely aware of it, but I don't think I can offer any expert advice on it.
But suffice it to say, it was a special pay authority that was thought to be necessary to attract scientists to HHS when EPA was split off as a separate agency. You don't need special pay authority for, say, a beginning chemist in a lab at the EPA. We're looking at a time where every tax dollar that's spent should come under scrutiny. Something I've worked on for several years is to get rescission of that special pay authority for the Environmental Protection Agency. And unfortunately, as we've learned now coming through the coronavirus emergency, some of that special pay authority was going to some of our very highly paid NIH scientists. And I think in retrospect, you'd have to ask yourself, were those dollars well spent? And that's still an open question, but I don't think you'd convince the American taxpayer that they would want to continue that. On the other component of improper payments, Ms. Grensler, I would stress an improper payment does not necessarily mean fraudulent. It simply can be a payment that was submitted that wasn't entirely accurate. But Medicaid stands out as one of those where the improper payment rate is strikingly above the overall average of improper payments in the federal government. Is that not correct?
That's correct. An improper payment is a payment made to the wrong person or in the wrong amount. About 95% of those are all overpayments. Medicaid is most problematic, I would say, because it is administered by a state agency. They often aren't checking the eligibility for them. And also, it's just an incredibly complicated program, and the healthcare market is distorted by it being largely funded through the government. So there's a whole host of things feeding into that improper payment rate.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I'm supposed to recognize any Democrats. Oh, I do see. Recognize Ms. Jackson Lee from Texas for 5 minutes.
Turn on, so. Let me lay the groundwork, Mr. Gupta, for what I'd like to ask questions for. Moody Analytics estimates that the default on America and a default would result in more than 7 million jobs lost, an unemployment rate over 8%, and a wipeout of $10 trillion in household wealth. Mortgage rates and consumer borrowing rates would increase, and the status of the dollar as a reserve currency of the world would be at risk. I want Houston, Texas to be aware of that. I want Texas to be aware of that. In addition, if we had a default, after talking about Democrats and their support of law enforcement, these Republicans will in fact cut the Department of Justice over $8 billion and threaten 30,000 law enforcement. That's a threat to public safety, which I'd like to put on the record. And we know that the Default on America bill has a threat. It has a trigger. It says that we'll give you a dime, $1.5 trillion in debt, raising the debt, and then we got to come back again for whenever we meet that, or maybe March. So we're just playing daggers with the working families of America, just daggers. We're just shooting them in the foot and many people in the heart. Texas, for example, 1.6 million families in Texas get SNAP, and the roughly 5.746 million Medicaid would face a mountain of paperwork, which in essence would weed out vulnerable children, which is what we need to be aware of. Let me tell my fellow Texans, deny 1,100 Texans admission to opioid treatment. If you talk about raising the mental health crisis or even crime, that's your pathway. Jeopardize air safety by shutting down at least 24 air traffic control towers in Texas. I represent Bush Intercontinental in Houston. Estimate 27,400 preschool children and child care slots gone immediately. I remember during the pandemic standing in front of child care centers begging for resources as parents were desperate to be able to find places for their children who are out of school. Strip food assistance from 994,000 Texas, 855,000, threatening 855,000 Texans with restrictions. Making college more expensive for 587,900 Texans, raising housing costs in an already oversaturated market where people can't find housing for 40,000 Texans. And so let me go directly, if you would, answer these questions, and maybe very briefly, we're in the aftermath of the Trump tax cuts that we suffered. By the way, you know, on the record, we raised, as Democrats, collectively, the debt ceiling 3 times under the past administration. Give me, quickly, because I have a snap question, a lingering effect of the dastardly Trump tax cut. Did it generate revenue into the economy, or did it give corporate America, billionaires, a fat cushion, maybe a soft pillow, if you will?
It's yet another example of the failure of trickle-down economics. The Trump tax cuts failed to deliver the thousands of dollars of increase in incomes that were promised by the Council of Economic Advisors. They failed to deliver any meaningful increase in job growth, and unfortunately delivered a huge amount of debt.
And do you see, I started, as you well know, with the Moody analytics, you see a truth in that mass loss of jobs and $10 trillion in household wealth, which are working families or middle-class families. You see value or veracity in that?
That's right. Even getting close to the debt limit without raising it will have severe financial consequences.
Now let's work on this. You know, here's some old issues that you might not have been around to hear, but you remember in the early administrations, this whole thing about get to work if you're on benefits. Get to work. And that was supposed to be one of the saving graces of the economy. So let me just get right to it. Does the increasing age limit do anything to help more people find work, or will it simply increase hunger? And as well, explain, it's not an employment program. And able-bodied people get off anyhow because of state rules. Could you explain that, please, and why we're wasting time with the default in America and making it worse for hungry people?
Adding new work reporting and documentation requirements will be counterproductive, will not help people work. We've tried this repeatedly. We know it undermines people's ability to have that basic foundation they need to access opportunity, succeed in the labor market, pursue education, and support their families.
Are the people needing to get SNAP children who are the basic population of hungry people in America?
Absolutely.
And what we're doing with Default on America is really undermining our own safety net, putting children in dangerous health conditions as well as hunger conditions without having a viable program.
Yes, and for those kids, the safety net's really a trampoline.
Have you seen massive fraud or waste?
No,
You're in the business. So
SNAP does an incredible job of getting payments right.
Let me thank you so very much for your response. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much for your indulgence. I yield back.
I'm always better at indulging my colleagues when they're from Texas.
Mr. Chairman.
I have a really bad record about that.
Well,
Thank you for your comments.
I thank you.
And now I will yield 5 minutes to my friend from North Carolina, Mr. Chuck Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dutta-Gupta, do you believe that folks making more than $400,000 a year ought to be paying more taxes than they are today?
Yes.
Do you believe that folks making less than $400,000 should be paying more taxes than they're paying today?
I think you'll probably have to do that if you want to do things like paid family and medical leave and meet our nation's caregiving needs.
And so President Biden has told us over and over again that he intends to not ask folks making less than $400,000 to pay more. So it sounds like you disagree with President Biden.
While the president's budget may well stabilize debt as a share of GDP over the long run, I think to meet some of our nation's crucial needs, including climate policy, some people between $250K and $400,000, who others here on your side have already described as wealthy, should be able to contribute more.
And so I hear that you do disagree with what the president has been telling us about his tax policy.
I would not draw the line at $400,000.
I find it interesting. I'm going back to your testimony that you made comments regarding folks needing to work for let's just call it SNAP benefits. You said for people who can't prove that they are working or exempt, it would create a particular hardship. And you go on to say that many people might even lose benefits, even though they are working or should qualify, but then they fail to keep up with paperwork requirements. Are you familiar with what those paperwork requirements are?
Yes, and in Arkansas, when they tried this for Medicaid, it bumped off so many people who actually were complying that Arkansas itself is now acknowledging that they failed.
And so how often would someone have to complete paperwork to qualify for these benefits?
That can vary.
Monthly?
The benefits can be to document work.
The benefits are established monthly, are they not?
Many benefits are established monthly,
Yeah,
yeah.
and-
Some you can get a tranche.
And
of.
so the answer to my question is monthly. Do you realize that folks that are working and raising their families and paying to feed their families today have to be involved in some activity? Plumbers are underneath houses, working on fixtures and piping. Bricklayers are out all day. They're working with their hands, often in the sunshine. Welders have to do something all day to provide for their families. Factory workers have to be on a production line all day. And you're trying to tell this committee that for folks to receive benefits, it's a hardship for them to complete paperwork once a month? I'm not sure that I understand that.
Yeah, they're often
line of
struggling with
reasoning.
substance use challenges, with violence, lots of challenges that maybe you or I are not facing, and the way that these systems are created
Thank you.
make
And
it
so,
hard.
and so you recognize that what we have in the Limit, Save, and Grow Act is that able-bodied, childless adults should work for their benefits. And you're trying to tell this committee that you don't believe that they should work for
The research shows that it's precisely giving the benefits that can often help them work, help their families do better. So people need health care, they need food to be able to succeed in the labor market.
So filling out a form once a month seems to be
It's much harder than that.
a real hardship.
And often rejected for inappropriate reasons.
All right. Thank you for that. Ms. Grasler, thanks so much for being with us today. I appreciated hearing your testimony. We've seen President Biden promise time and time again that the middle-class families making less than $400,000 per year, wouldn't be affected by proposed tax hikes, and yet he is allowing the Trump-era tax cuts to expire. The numbers that I've read say that means families will be paying even less than $250,000, will be paying maybe $2,000 more per year. And I don't believe that this boils down to pure tax policy for this administration. It's the latest trend in policies with an ideology bend. In your view, does the Biden administration's $400,000 number send a message to Americans that at the end of the day, it doesn't pay to succeed?
I think it does, but more importantly, that $400,000 figure is not possible if you want to fund everything that the Biden administration wants to. And we've had statistics done at the Heritage Foundation that show you could confiscate every single dollar of somebody earning over $200,000, and you would still not pay for half of the left's agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see my time has expired, so I yield.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina, and now we'll yield 5 minutes to Ms. Espaillat from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mister, I apologize.
Yes. I don't want to be the subject of one of their testimonies. Mr. Gupta, the proposed cuts have been presented in a way that leadership has asserted they would protect certain areas and not cut those particular areas, including Social Security. They asserted that they will not touch Social Security. On many occasions, they've said that. Defense, Homeland Security, and Medicare. I heard some say they will not cut Medicare. If that occurs, of course, this will impact the level of cuts in other areas because you will have to sort of like make up the funding somewhere. What is your projection on the levels of cuts for other areas if these particular areas, if they kept their promise and did not cut these areas?
So a lot depends. It's intentionally vague, and that means we have to assume a few things. But if we assume veterans' medical care, which on the non-defense side is sort of the largest single item for appropriations, is protected, and we assume growth that we meet the needs of veterans, we see the similar growth that we've had in defense in recent years, you may have to eliminate virtually all that's left.
And do you feel that this massive budget cuts will have not just an impact on the quality of services and the services rendered to average Americans, but that it will also have an impact on the economy? What do you think is the impact of this scheme on the economy?
That's right. Moody's estimates that several 100,000 jobs would be lost. Our government does actually support our labor force and ensures that we have high employment, especially compared to a lot of our peer countries. And these investments, including non-defense discretionary investments, support our economic activity across the board.
And what do you think it will have, the impact that it will have in more than just a budget cycle, let's say in the next decade, if these cuts were perpetrated?
Well, we're already far below 47-year averages on the non-defense discretionary side. We have seen real harm, inability to keep up with needs on Social Security administration, for example. People have to wait a long time for disability benefits, retirement benefits, et cetera. But similarly on just basic safety functions of the government. And that will only worsen over time.
Now, Mr. Gupta, I think you made a good assessment on the impact on the economy, but the Default on American Act would also impose work requirement on Medicaid recipients and increase work requirements for SNAP recipients, right? It is often the assumption their assumption is that individuals are not working and relying on safety net programs to meet the basic needs. Which groups do you think this will hurt? How will this hurt America?
Well, it'll catch a lot of people, even people maybe the Republicans don't intend to catch, because it turns out a lot of people who fail to meet these sorts of requirements actually might have been exempt. They might have been compliant. But when you're a student, say, working full-time and you should be exempt, but you're focusing on your studies, dealing with another agency and their requirements and documentation, this isn't about just going online and filling out a form. There's a lot of forced documentation. So all of that would sweep a lot of people into this sort of dragnet.
And what would you think the long-term effect that this increased requirements will have on the workforce and the economy? We're talking about the economy. That's why we're here. This is the Budget Committee.
Right. Counterproductive. I mean, we know Medicaid improves student achievement. We know kids who grow up in families that participate in SNAP do much better when they're adults than otherwise. So this is completely counterproductive, penny wise and pound foolish.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. I yield back, Mr.
I thank Mr. Espaillat from New York and will now yield to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lloyd Smucker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just follow up, Mr. Gupta, on the conversation that occurred there. And I'll say, there are some things I think we agree on. One, we want to try to lift people out of poverty and give everyone a chance to live their own American dream. There was, just in context, a group in my area, was a Democrat mayor of the largest city in my district that did a study on poverty. And out of that came sort of an effort to bring together all of the different organizations. And the report was called One Good Job. And the intent, or sort of the end goal, was to connect as many people as possible with a great family-sustaining job. We also agree that, I think we all believe we're fortunate to live in a country where there is a safety net for people who are not able to access and provide for themselves. But based on some of your comments, I just want to ask you, do you think everyone who should be working or could be working should be?
Absolutely. We should try to make sure there's a good job for all of them.
And how would, people who are relying on government programs now, we want to move them, which was, again, the intent, the goal of this program. The success was measured by putting people on that ladder of upward mobility by connecting them with a good paying job. How would you accomplish that for people who are not currently there today?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you, Representative Smucker, for the line of questions. So,
And I don't have a lot of time.
yeah,
but
so
again-
we do have employment and jobs programs, some
Yeah.
of which would actually likely be cut, unfortunately, under
Yeah.
the bill. But it turns out that the programs themselves, by giving people that very basic foundation we all need, food, healthcare, actually does help them. We saw this with the child tax credit expansion. People spent money on things that help them do more, work more. More childcare, for example, would be a great way for us to promote more employment.
And so I literally don't understand why you think that work requirements would work against that. Like, why would we not want to do everything we can to encourage people who can to take a job or to do everything they can to find a job? Why is that so bad?
Yeah, it turns out it expands bureaucracy, red tape. It bumps a lot of people off benefits who shouldn't be bumped off, even under the rules. And it just adds a lot of stress and would create a lot more challenges for people who are just trying to have that basic foundation. It's much easier to find a job and do well when you're well-fed and you've got healthcare you need. You know, people who are accessing substance use disorder treatment, for example, they could lose that. And that would help them get a job.
I think your position misses the importance of incentives and of ensuring that we are trying to incentivize the right thing to help people access a good job. I want to get back. There's one other issue, Ms. Gressler. And I want to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, if I may, CBO's April 2023 report titled Expired and Expiring Authorizations of Appropriations for Fiscal Year 2023.
Without objection, so ordered.
And let's see here. The House and Senate rules require that all spending in appropriations bills be authorized by law. But this particular report by CBO reports that $1.7 trillion in fiscal year 2023 in the omnibus included, the omnibus of $1.7 trillion included $510 billion in appropriations for unauthorized or expired programs. Is that any concern to you?
Yes,
Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I think that's over 400 programs that are currently
428 programs, I think.
unauthorized or expiring, and that is Congress's job to make sure that they are funding only the programs that have been authorized and that are still supposed to be funded. There is the Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act of 2023.
I don't even understand how we can today spend it, because very clearly House Rule 21 prohibits spending for unauthorized or expired programs, yet we spend $500 billion on this type of spending. Like, how is that happening, and what can we do to stop it?
Well, it's happening because there's still funding being appropriated for them, even though they are not authorized. And so, as I mentioned, the Unauthorized Spending Accountability Act of 2023 would essentially expire all those unauthorized programs after 3 years if Congress doesn't explicitly reauthorize them and fund them.
Do you think, as an individual member or members together, do you think we'd have an opportunity to object to unauthorized spending during consideration of appropriations bill? And if so, how would that be done?
Yeah, I think not just an opportunity, but an obligation that funds should not be going to programs that are unauthorized.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and yield 5 minutes now to Ms. Wexton from Virginia.
Today.
There you go.
Thank you very much to witnesses for being here today. Federal workers are the backbone of our government and carry out important functions and services every day that keep our country running smoothly. It's unfortunate that my colleagues across the aisle hosting this hearing aimed at disparaging federal workforce during Public Service Recognition Week. But what's worse than that are the cuts that they're considering. The proposal would be catastrophic for families across the country. It's designed to make it more difficult for federal employees to serve the American people, almost as if they don't want government to function effectively. Pediatric mental health. In the U.S., we're in the middle of a pediatric mental health crisis, and as a mother, I'm heartbroken that we're not doing more for our children. Proud to have fought for programs to help address the youth mental health crisis, including getting more mental health professionals in schools, studying the impact of social media on children's development and well-being, and the 988 suicide hotline. The proposed cuts threaten families' access to these crucial programs in the middle of a crisis. Mr. Gupta, how would decreased funding limit access to care for our kids and our families? How would this decrease funding that the Republicans are proposing in their budget? How would that limit the actions for, how would that limit access to care for our kids and families, please?
Yeah, it would be significant. We're already facing the end of the continuous coverage requirement in Medicaid because of the end of the public health emergency. We're expecting up to 15 million people to lose coverage. People need health insurance coverage to access the care and treatment that they need. And for young people and families, including those struggling with mental health challenges, it's often the only way that they can possibly be at their best. And I think that's what we all want. So they need that coverage. That is not being provided often in low-paid jobs, and it's not being provided through any other means than these public programs.
Care?
That's a great point. In some cases, they'd have to wait till it becomes an acute crisis, which is the worst possible outcome.
It's not only bad for their health, it's also bad for the bottom line, for sure.
That's right.
The cuts could impact hundreds of thousands of children and cause them to lose access to child care in preschool, including for nearly 6,000 children in Virginia. What impact would this have on children's well-being at large in larger economy, women in the workforce? What impact would loss of child care access have on women in the workforce as well as their children?
One of the clearest findings in research is that childcare helps women succeed in the labor market. So you would be undermining our labor force participation and employment to population ratios. Women disproportionately bear care burdens, as we know, and childcare is really unquestionably valuable investment with a meaningful return for taxpayers and the country overall.
How about pre-K?
You know, pre-K as well. I mean, we could lose hundreds of thousands of Head Start slots too with a bill that's been passed by the House. And that has long-term payoff. Those investments, we know, dramatically improve the outcomes of kids who go to those programs. When they're adults, they graduate from school at higher rates, they go to college at higher rates, they do better in jobs, higher earnings, higher employment rates.
So something that we want to encourage, right?
Yeah.
The Inflation Reduction Act includes significant funding to help IRS employees address its backlog of unprocessed returns and provide better service. We're already seeing benefits this year. I know that in our office we have very few complaints this tax season, which last year we had many. I'm glad that the increased funding has really helped with that. We're also seeing a lot of cases that have been open for a long time be closed. So I'm very pleased to see these new people that we've hired at IRS are actually working on customer service for a change. My colleagues across the aisle have tried to claw these desperately needed funds back. How would this impact IRS ability to modernize technology, reduce backlog, and increase improved customer service, Mr.?
That's right. We're addressing a long-standing challenge at the IRS, so it would completely reverse some of the gains that are underway that improve people's experience interacting with the IRS, reduce errors that others here have discussed today, reduce improper payments, and help more people get the payments that are they're eligible for, including some key tax credits.
Thank you very much. One other question for you. Earlier this week, I met with a group of people from our ID and DD communities, intellectually developmentally disabled communities, people who depend on SSI to live. And what would happen if the Social Security, the cuts to Social Security that are being proposed by the majority were to take place?
They'd have to wait longer and longer for eligibility determinations, redeterminations, possibly be denied life-sustaining benefits.
Thank you very much. And those are the most vulnerable people in our society. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady from Virginia, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Utah, Mr. Blakemore.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member. Mr. Ebel, I'm going to start off with just a few questions and hope to get to some of the energy-related things that you've worked on. But are we at as high a debt to GDP as we were in World War II?
Representative Moore, I think we are at a point that is in the same vicinity. I think what we need to understand is World War II was an existential crisis. It wasn't just a phony claim of existential crisis.
Or bad planning.
Or bad planning, yes.
I like to highlight to a lot of my constituents that not a single, it's bad planning, that we are not dealing with a catastrophic World War III, right? We're not. our revenues are as high as they've been, right? Our spending is far higher than it's ever been. Would you also agree that with Larry Summers, former economic advisor to Obama and Secretary of Treasury, President Clinton, that a $2 trillion bill done within a very, very short time frame with no real offset spending is going to increase inflation?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so the other thing that I've noticed about this lovely place of Washington, D.C., I'm in my second term, things are actually a lot more predictable than you would assume. When Republicans lost the Senate, control of the Senate on January 5th, 2021, I said to many of my colleagues, we're gonna see a record amount of spending this term. The same can also be true, and I think that they could expect, that my Democratic colleagues could expect, that when we won the majority in the House, oh, you're gonna see Republicans push back on spending. That's not like earth-shattering news. That should be predictable to everybody here. So when the debt ceiling comes up, and we push back and we put a bill that has an enormous amount of spending cuts in there, is that a surprise to anybody? Do you think that that should have been a surprise to anybody?
No, and I'm a little bit dismayed by the fact that it's claimed that the Republican bill is somehow a denial of the debt ceiling crisis. The bill passed by the House raises the debt ceiling. I'm not real happy about that, and maybe you aren't.
It's hard for
either.
fiscal conservatives. It's going to be
But-
hard for people in Utah.
But
which
the fact
one of
is,
the most-
the House is the only part of the tripart structure of our system that has addressed the debt ceiling.
Do you think we should be at least exploring opportunities for restraint in our spending right now? Given those realities, our highest debt to GDP ratio, we've never had spending we just came off of 2 years of the record spending. Do you think we should at least explore some constraints?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Easy questions. I get that. I'm not trying to be flippant. But I would love your perspective on one particular thing with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act. There has been some, and I've looked into this, there's been some independent review of the cost of that bill. Is there an area that we could come together and say, yeah, that's far more expensive than what it was set out to do? It's also not going to target lower income individuals. If you give an EV tax credit to folks, those are wealthier individuals that can buy an electric vehicle, and they're the ones that are going to benefit from that bill. Is there an opportunity to look at that bill and say, we can claw back some of this and find a way to restrain some of this spending?
Well, yes. As you know, I support, and CEI supports the complete repeal of all of the energy subsidies and handouts in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. But yes, if there has to be compromise, and I understand that legislation is a messy business, then I think you could put caps on, for example, the amount of money that will be expended for the various subsidy categories, because they're all uncapped, they're open-ended.
And then another thing that I find fascinating, and from the years of 2011 to 2018, when Republicans had control of the at least the House, like you saw significant cuts to discretionary spending. Did our government continue to operate? Did we continue to provide services to people? Were we able to look in that budget and find areas to cut? You know, obviously leading towards this concept that we can roll the clock back about 5 months, about when we were operating under FY22, roll it back to that time frame and put some spending caps going forward. Is that completely unreasonable?
It's reasonable.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Utah, and now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been called here today to talk about a woke government. Fascinating. Our government's barreling toward a default on its debt. Americans are dying in record numbers from mass shootings. Americans are dying in record numbers from suicides. Americans are dying in record numbers from drug overdoses. Yet here we are, talk about wokeism, and women are living in fear of horrific limits on abortion access to their health care. We came to Congress to try and get stuff done and to help and focus on our nation's most important problems. Frankly, wokeism isn't it. Also like to correct the record of the previous gentleman. We talk about the deficit under the last year of President Obama was, give or take, $480 billion. Third year of President Trump, before COVID, before that hit, it increased a record amount, more than it's ever increased. Under President Trump, the biggest increase ever to our deficit, up to $980 billion, because of a ridiculous tax cut to C corporations from 35 to 21%, which effective rate is probably 10 to 12%. Why are our C corporations, Google, Apple, eBay, paying 10 and 12% when our hardworking families are paying 15, 20, 25%? That doesn't make any sense. But President Trump, after last night's debate of lies and lies and lies, the Republicans can't seem to get out of their way on what's truth and what's lies. Well, we got to go with the facts. The facts are where we are in life. So let's try and talk about the deficit with reality and not just make up a bunch of BS because it fits the talking points that some staffer gave someone that's never ran a business, never had a payroll, doesn't have any conception what the deficit really means. Last month, the Republicans released the Default on America Act. The debt ceiling was drafted, no hearings, no transparency. That's because it's a bad deal for working Americans. The Default on America Act would hurt our country, hurt our people, hurt our children, hurt our future. But extreme Republicans still voted to pass it. Mr. Gupta, on a brighter note, this week is Teachers Week, Teacher Appreciation. What a great time to recognize America's teachers and the important role they play. But extreme Republicans have a funny way of celebrating. The Department of Education is estimated from the Default on America Act to lose $4 billion cut from schools serving low-income students, resulting 60,000 fewer teachers. 60,000 less teachers. That's the Republicans' plan. That doesn't sound too good about our children, does it? Not to me. Your testimony explores how these critical programs, such as Head Start, we all have to love Head Start. It works. We know it works. For our children and our families, this debt ceiling is going to result in hundreds of thousands of children losing access to these programs. So in addition to hurting the children, hurting the families, how might these cuts have that opposite effect on the economy? What are they going to do to the economy than what the Republicans claim they're going to do?
It will slow our growth or even shrink our economy. It will reduce the foundation of our economy that the government does play a central role in ensuring.
Bring our growth rate to a halt. Stop an economy that's growing. Stop an economy that has record folks working in the economy, the record low unemployment. Stop all of those awesome things that have happened. Instead, bring us backwards because they don't understand that a nation has to carry debt. And as a nation gets bigger, we carry more debt than we do in World War II. What a stupid question. World War II debt, what was happening in 1945, compare our economy today in 2023 to 45, and somehow that's germane? It's not germane. Mr. Gupta, your thoughts?
The United States can clearly afford this debt. People will be willing to continue to buy United States debt if we don't threaten the validity of it. It is one of the safest, if not the safest, investment in the world and in extraordinary demand and continues to be.
As you get bigger, you have more debt. My company at $6 billion has hundreds of millions more debt than we had at $1 billion. That's the way it works.
You can use it to finance investments. When you buy a house,
How you
you're in
grow,
debt.
how you build. Thank you, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland and yield 5 minutes to my friend from Minnesota, Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that last exchange just explains to me, it's a perfect example of the absurd arguments that are being made to increase the out-of-control spending. And I did have some questions, but after sitting here for a while, excuse me, I have to say a few words because the the arguments that are being made, and I think that Representative McLean was talking a little bit about, pleading with the other side to come and help us get this spending under control. But they continue to use these outrageous emotional arguments about the things that that would get cut. And they will not admit that there is, that we can do better, There are things that could be scaled back, that can be, let's face it, cut in the federal government. There are places, but instead, what we always end up hearing about is, of course, they're going to cut, food to children. And I think that was one of the examples that Representative McLean used. And, it is typical fashion for the Democrats to throw out the most extreme and emotional arguments that they can find because they're unwilling to admit that there's out of control spending. I've been here 2 years, and all I've seen is Democrats spend money the first 2 years I was here. And now they're unwilling to admit, and they can blame it on Trump, they can blame it on Republicans, whatever, but let's face it, we have to get this under control. There was a mention of this is going to hurt our children, this is going to hurt our future. Having the spending cuts, we're going to hurt them, but having this kind of out of control debt is going to hurt them even more and hurt the future of the country. And like I said, I had some questions, but I really felt the need to just get that out because the other side is just unwilling to admit it. Just plain and simple. They will make no efforts to cut a dime because what they want to do is continue to spend and spend and spend and spend and they feel like there's no responsibility to the taxpayers, to those middle-class folks, the lower income folks that they talk so passionately about, but they're paying for this debt too. And we have to get it under control. We have to get spending under control. And so I feel very strongly that the American people want us to do this. They want us to get this under control. They understand that out of control debt, out of control spending does nobody any good. And I had to say that, I had to get it off my chest, because as I sit here and I listen to these ridiculous arguments that we're gonna, we're gonna starve children, we're gonna do all kinds of horrible things, then come to the table and help us figure out this issue. That's all I ask. If they don't want that to happen, then where are they? They claim all these horrible, horrible things, but won't actually help. But won't actually admit that there's even a problem. And they talk about we could potentially, we can afford this debt, doesn't make sense. So I ask, and I appreciate all of the witnesses being here, and all of you've put up with a lot of us all day long, and you've been here for the long haul, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate all your work. But I just, I had to talk a little bit about that, because it has been so frustrating today to hear that they won't even come to the table and help. So thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady from Minnesota and yield to another gentlelady from Oklahoma, my friend, Miss Stephanie Bice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Boyle. I first want to start out by saying that the comment was made earlier that obligations were made and that the United States needs to pay their debt. But let me be very clear, obligations were made by some. I was not one of those. In the last 2 years, $11 trillion worth of obligations were made. I did not agree with many of them. And it's sort of rich to sit here in this room and hear the other side of the aisle talk about how this didn't go through proper order, because I don't recall a single one of those very large bills not only going through proper order, but not accepting amendments to be able to cut some of the wasteful spending that was in those bills. So it's frustrating for me to sit here and hear to be lectured by that. Now, my friend on the other side of the aisle brought up a great point. He said it's Teacher Appreciation Week, and I am incredibly honored to have my sister-in-law as a teacher back home. Shout out to Lisa, you're doing an amazing job. Mr. Gupta, how much did Democrats appropriate in fiscal year 23 for the Department of Education?
I don't know.
$175 billion. Do you know how much they appropriated in fiscal year 23 for the Department of Energy, including loan payments?
I don't, but I bet you do.
$478 billion. Seems to me that Democrats care more about climate change than kids. Let me make a couple of points on that particular issue. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act, enacted last year, gave $271 billion in tax credits to pay for green energy projects favored by Democrat donor class. The preliminary JCT estimate, independent analysis, keeps raising the price tag on that, with one recent estimate putting the green subsidy handouts at $1.2 trillion. The debt ceiling is tied to spending. That's why we're in the position we're in, because we keep writing checks that the government can't cash. This has to stop. And to the points that have been made by my colleagues, McLean and Fishbach and many others, you can't sit here today and tell me that there is not one single dollar that can be cut. And we've been told over and over here in the press every day that Republicans haven't done anything. Hogwash. We passed a debt ceiling with offsets because we recognize that this is an unsustainable path. We can't continue down the road that we've been going over the last couple of years. So, Ms. Gessler, interest rates have been hiked up 10 times in response to Bidenflation. More Americans are unable to buy a home than they were a year ago. Can you talk about how interest rates are impacting the current situation with debt?
Yes, the interest rates are exacerbating, and those interest rates were caused by excessive government spending, most of which was passed after the crisis was truly over. And the problem here, in talking about from the other side, saying that the Republicans' Limit, Save, Grow Act is not accounting for inflation, Americans are already paying for their own inflation. Their wages have gone up by over $5,000, but inflation has eaten away over $8,000. So they're actually $3,000 poorer, and now they're being asked to pay for the government share of inflation on top of that, within the next year alone, $11,500 in added debt to every household.
Mr. Ebel, Ms. Augustin, do you want to comment on that too?
Yes, I appreciate your focus on the energy slush funds in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And one of the things that you ought to focus on, you mentioned the Department of Energy. The Inflation Reduction Act raises the loan authority for green energy by $350 billion. That's a lot of cylinders.
Ms. Augustine, if you want to quickly comment on that as well, the interest rates issue.
Well, if you don't mind, I don't want to comment about interest rates. What I do
Fair
want to
enough.
say is to your sister-in-law, I believe you said as a teacher, I just think that the teachers are as much a victim as the students when the woke ideology has totally overtaken the institution that is our education system. I don't think your sister-in-law wants to teach kids that America is systemically racist.
Amen. To your comment about energy, I want to make a couple of points here, Mr. Bill, if I may. The Inflation Reduction Act has given so much money to these sort of Green New Deal initiatives, including the estimates on the cost of electric vehicle battery production alone could cost upwards of $196 billion. That's 540% more than the initial estimate of $30 billion. But the bigger issue here is China. China controls 50% of the processing capacity of key EV battery inputs like lithium, cobalt, and graphite. We, through these policies that Democrats have passed in the last 2 years, are becoming more and more and more reliant on China, and that is a problem for the future. Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So $1.4 trillion is what will overspend the Congressional Budget Office projects this year. That was the size of our gross national debt exactly 40 years ago. So for all of us that can remember where we were 40 years ago, and to think about the optimism, and to know it took us 200 years as a nation to get to 1.4 trillion gross national debt, we'll overspend this year in 1 year what it took us 200 years to accumulate in debt. And then 10 years from now, the Congressional Budget Office says that's just the interest payments on our debt. It was mentioned a minute ago, I'm appreciative, you take the $6.2 trillion spend, multiply it times 0.77, or 0.72 rather, you do find out that in 2017, that our government was 30% less than the size that it is today. So 30% less the size of government, totality in our spending, 6.2 comparative to 4.5, we were that much less in the size of our government. Then if you look at our dollar, I have a little prop, right? Props are fun. We know that since 2017, that if I fold back about 20% of this instrument of purchasing, that's the devaluation of our currency since 2017. So at the same time that our government's grown 30%, we've lost 20% of the value of our spending. And it's amazing. It's not just the devaluation of the currency, it's that the countries around the world, someone said a while ago, I don't mean to be mean-spirited, but we talked about the strength of our world reserve currency. In 1983, that was an accurate statement, but when you have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa going, wait a minute, we think we'll create our own European Union type currency. What's caused many people to believe in quantitative easing for years has been the thought that the world reserve currency would save us in our petrodollar. That's being questioned. And so, man, we have got to take an honest look at the problems that are before us. It's really astounding that when we look at the spending and people say, well, it's about the not spending enough here. The Democrat ideology is sacrificing our prosperity on the altar of the church of nature when it comes to what they're doing with going after what needs to be another dot-com type boom in America. We've got to cut and we've got to grow. And I appreciate you bringing up a while ago that from 92 to 2000, there was a 4% economic growth, GDP. Well, what's causing us to get in the 1% now in this first quarter? It's because we're fighting with our hands tied behind our back, and China and Russia are laughing at us. We've become not work brittle, they're work brittle. They're not abiding by the Paris Climate Accord, and yet we're fighting with our hands tied behind our back because of a woke ideology. And we've got to grow past this, and we've got to grow up, and we've got to stop appeasing radical ideology. Food prices up 17% in the last several years, since 2021. Since the Biden administration took over, gas prices up 37%. Real wages decreased 3.5%. Somebody today will spend, on average, $13,000 more to buy the exact same goods and services as they did, prior to Biden taking office as a family. The ability to buy a home, to get a mortgage because of rising interest rates, 15% higher than just a year ago. Small businesses struggling to find line of credit. More seniors seeing their lifetime savings wiped out because of this. And then top 3-tier type banks looking to having to go under because of this system that we've created. It's a self-inflicted wound. All right. So I want to jump to Paige. You, Ms. Gostin, I apologize. You had mentioned earlier some of the egregious spending. I loved it. I love that you're trying to call us on the carpet as a nation when some say there's no way to reduce spending. Department of Health and Human Services, National Institute of Health, actively pushing so-called gender-affirming care, which is cross-sex hormones and surgical mutilation even for minors. I wrote a letter to the NIH a week or so ago about this. A couple of suicides, and it gets brushed under the rugs. And hundreds of young adults, minors, these are young children we're giving cross-sex therapy to, hormone treatment, and you have suicides. And this is what the federal government prioritizes? So I want to ask you a question. It's not just that. It's not just the hypersexualized culture. It's also where we're going backwards when it comes to race. And we're trying to drive ourselves back to a place to where we're incentivizing a focus on not being colorblind, but looking at color versus the content of your character. Can you speak to that?
Sure, if I may. There was somebody quoting Merriam-Webster. I will just quote Kendi. If racial discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. So they redefine language, as you do when you're embarking on a cultural revolution, in order to reestablish systems of discrimination based on identity, race being one of them.
I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, and now you have 5 minutes from my friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Glenn Grothman.
Thank you. I just got a few questions here. It seems our country's in a lot of trouble, and I just like to focus on things that I think make that problem worse. Ms. Gressler, I want to focus a little bit on the earned income tax credit. It's something I've long disliked for a variety of reasons. One of the most embarrassing things Republicans have done, I think, in the last 40 years. But that tax credit, which is really a welfare payment, is this right that almost 32% of the payments are improper every year?
No, it's incredibly inefficient, and it's costing $1.46 from one person to transfer that $1 of earned income tax credit to somebody else.
It's very inefficient, right? And 32% of the payments are improper, which I'll believe because it's so easy to cheat on it. Is that accurate?
Correct.
Okay. Could you comment on, in general, you think it was something we should keep going? Or is it one of those places where we're giving a lot of money to people maybe are only getting it fraudulently, and it discourages work too, doesn't it? Do you want to lecture the committee on how it discourages work?
Yes, in the phase-out ranges of that credit, it imposes very high marginal tax rates that discourage people from pursuing either more work or from pursuing education that would allow them to further climb the career ladder. And so I
Is it
think
true, depending on your family size, it discourages you from making another $16,000 a year, or $20,000 or $26,000 or whatever? The well-informed will say, sorry, I can't improve myself more than, say, $25,000 a year, I'm going to lose my earned income tax.
yes, that program combined with others actually makes sense for people to not pursue better opportunities.
Well, thank you. Very good. That's what we want to hear. Next thing, President Biden's so-called American Rescue Plan expanded the child tax credit by removing work requirements and turning it into an unconditional cash payment per child. What effect on the moral fiber of this country will these changes have?
It's incredibly problematic, and there were studies that showed that for the lowest income children, that would actually make them worse off because it would reduce labor force participation. And this is not a partisan issue. I like to remind people President Clinton quoted Robert Kennedy when he said, "Work is the meaning of what this country is all about. We need it as individuals, we need to sense it in our fellow citizens, and we need it as a society and as a people." Work is crucial, especially when you have children in the home, to building those foundations for success. And today, what we're talking about in some of the limits that have been put, the work requirements and the Limit Save Grow Act, those are not even targeted at individuals with children. Those are individuals without children, older ones. And when I've been looking at what's happening in the labor force today, employment among people who have no children under the age of 18 at home is down by 1.6%. Employment of people who have children in the home is up by 1.3%. So it's not the families with children that are struggling today. Their employment has improved. It's predominantly people who don't have children at home who are not working.
So I want you to restate that in this fashion. They always talk about the booming economy and the low unemployment rate. But that unemployment rate doesn't take into account people are sitting on their butt and not trying to get a job, does it?
There are 2 million people, 2 million fewer people working today, and I do want to correct that for the record. The employment to population ratio is not higher than it's ever been. It's lower, and it's the equivalent of 2 million lower compared to February 2020.
Okay, so over time, under the Biden administration, I think this is a goal of the progressive party. They like everybody dependent on the government. More and more people are just sitting it out because they can sit it out, or working for cash. Right? Now, we've got to mix it up a little bit here. Ms. Augustin, the Biden administration, a memo was released, or a whistleblower put it out there, encouraging the investigating of Catholic groups because I guess they don't like people who take their religion too seriously. They decided to also slander Catholic groups and say that they were, filled with white supremacists or working with white supremacy. How did the administration offer any justification for this action particularly within the, it would appear like, among other things, it's going against the free exercise of religion clause of the First Amendment?
Sure, and I think that's part and parcel of what this Department of Justice is. It's weaponized against the American people.
Right, and over time, this government, this big government, is going to be used to go after political enemies. in particular, not just political enemies, but religious enemies, as they always do in a totalitarian state. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin and yield 5 minutes to my friend from Georgia, Mr. Buddy Carter.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate all of you being here, and what an appropriate and timely hearing that we're having that's entitled Exposing the Woke, Wasteful, and Bloated Bureaucracy, and nothing could be further from the truth. Thank you for that. This is something we needed to have, Mr. Chairman, and I do thank you. You know, I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I've witnessed what has been going on with bloated and bureaucracies, and it's very frustrating, especially when it comes to energy and climate. And I see this rush to green. Look, I have the honor and privilege of representing the entire coast of Georgia, 100 miles of pristine coastline, and it also happens to be my home where I've lived all my life, and no one cares about the environment more than I do. So I discharge this theory that we don't care about the environment. We do care about the environment, but at the same time, what I've seen why this administration has been nothing less than an all-out war against fossil fuels. Day one, this administration declared war against fossil fuels. You know, we both parties share the same common goal, and that is to decrease carbon emissions. It is not to decrease choices. The United States has decreased our carbon emissions more in the last decade than the next 12 countries combined while growing our economy. We've proven that it can be done. And that's even today. Today, look at what's happening. The EPA's got a new power plan rule that will have significant new requirements on our baseload generation. More regulations. Unbelievable. I would submit to you that what is going on in our economy right now is self-inflicted. Day one, when this administration declared war on fossil fuels, price of gasoline went up, inflation went up, interest rates went up, and now we got the mess that we've got. Self-inflicted, unnecessary. And it just frustrates me to no end. Mr. Adele, I want to ask you, because you know a lot about climate policy and about free market environment, what type of consequences do you think that this administration and their policies have had on Americans, on everyday Americans, whether they make over $400,000 a year or whether they make less than $400,000 a year?
Thank you, Representative Carter. You know, I think the consequences of these policies are really bad economically on the American people. They're also bad environmentally. There are economic growth and opportunity are the basis of environmental protection. So when you degrade the economy, you will degrade the environment as well. So I think they're hiding a lot of bad things behind the climate blob, the green blob. They're saying, oh, we have to do all these things because of climate. But in fact, they have very deleterious impacts on the environment as well.
Thank you. Ms. Grasler, what about you? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that we're seeing the green energy agenda shift into other areas of the government as well, and even threaten them. I know that the U.S. Army right now is facing a recruitment shortage. And then at the same time that they are doing that, they were submitting a 50-page report of their new green energy climate plan. And so they're having to divert their resources towards fighting climate change instead of actually having the proper amount of army to protect the nation.
You know, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, Ms. Grasler, they have this government has spent over $500 billion in improper payments. But instead of seriously working to address that problem, the President Biden's budget proposes to inject even more spending on some of the worst performing programs such as Medicaid, which spent $80 billion improperly last year, a 15.6 improper payment rate increase. Again, another example of the federal government failing to do its job and not even attempting to fix it or get better. What are the consequences for taxpayers because of this lack of accountability?
Well, they're already paying about $1,800 per year, but I think it's incredibly insulting to them and causes them to lose faith in their government when the federal government expects taxpayers to pay the correct amount based on a 7,000-page tax code, and then the federal government when it's administering the programs that it designed itself, is spending $1,800 per household per year, $245 billion in total, making improper payments.
Well, I'm out of time, but I do want to thank y'all for being here. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, because this is a very appropriate, a very timely hearing that needs to be brought to the attention of the American people, because this rush to green, as if we don't care about the environment, is ridiculous. We do care about the environment, but we also care about our economy. We also care about people being able to make ends meet. That's what we want to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
I think my friend from Georgia couldn't agree more. We love God's great earth, and we are stewards of those natural resources, but we better be stewards of taxpayer resources or everything that anyone cares about on any side of the political spectrum will be irrelevant because we'll bankrupt the country. With that closing remark of mine, much shorter than my introduction, I might add, I want to thank the witnesses. You all do a lot of prep to come here, and you spend a lot of time with us. You've been generous. We appreciate your insights, your input, and God bless you. And we'll close by saying that members can submit written questions to be answered in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.